This happened years ago, but I still think of it often and refer to it as my scariest story. I was 20 and had just gotten my first car, a Ford Mustang convertible. It wasn't actually worth the price I paid for it, but I loved it dearly. My favorite thing in the world is to drive late at night on abandoned roads, and I was even more in love with it when I was 20 than now. I decided to take my car for a drive, and bear with me as I describe roads to you, because it does have bearing, I promise. I lived in the Denver metro area in Colorado at the time, and my favorite roads were the mountain roads. This time, however, I wanted to stay in range of cell service, as I'd been talking to a new beaut. So I drove down to Golden to follow Highway 93 along the Front Range up to Broomfield or Boulder. It's usually a pretty good and solitary drive at night, and as it was around 1 a.m., I knew I'd have the road all to myself. All was going pretty well. I had passed the roadwork and cop at the 72nd junction, and decided to get off on a road in Broomfield that would take me east, perpendicular to Highway 93 down a looping hilly street until I reached Indiana Street, Indiana, parallels Highway 93, until it ends against a road further south, close to where my home was. As I was turning onto Indiana, I saw the first cars I'd seen other than the cop at the 72nd and Highway 93. There was a large diesel pickup in front of me, and a red hatchback in front of them, also turning south onto Indiana. The hatchback, however, was going frustratingly slow. Indiana Street is a very hilly road, with speed limit of 50 or 55, and there are only 2 lanes, north and south. The truck decided after a while of us tooling behind the hatchback at 25 to cross the double yellow and go around the hatchback. They sped off into the distance, risking the low visibility of the hills, got back over, and disappeared out of my sight. The hatchback hadn't changed speed, but I decided to hang out behind them because the night was fine. I was in no rush, and I was scared of crossing the double yellow. Death Proof is my favorite car movie, but the images of head-on collisions never go away. I was confused at this point about the motives of the hatchback driver, but it didn't seem too horrible, so I stayed a car's lengths back and waited, going at about 25 miles per hour still. I checked my phone only to find that it was dead, and as I had only recently brought the car, I didn't have a charger with me for the cigarette port. This made me even more uneasy. When the hatchback slammed their brakes and came to a complete stop, and I couldn't see an animal or anything to warrant it, I was freaked out enough to overcome my fears. I crossed the double yellow and sped up to pass them, but they sped up too. Thinking it was a mistake, I sped up more, reaching the actual speed limit of 50 or 55. They matched me, and I was swiveling my head, trying to see into the driver's side window and looking out for incoming headlights at each hilltop. I sped up more, this time 65, and still nothing gives. They're matching me and keeping me from getting in front of them. I slowed down, backing off, but they slowed down too. Finally, scared out of my mind, I punched the gas, bringing me up to 80, and slipped back over the double yellow. They tried to match my speed, but I'd been significantly ahead of them for long enough to get over, although I was scared of scraping bumpers, as they were so close. I didn't know what to expect, But when they started bumping the back of my car with theirs, I was in full freak-out mode. I knew that 72nd was coming up, and if I took a right on it, I would get back to Highway 93 and the safety of the cop. So I turned my blinker on the far right of the junction to let this person know I intended to get out of their way for good. They didn't back off. If I slowed down, the pressure against my back bumper merely increased. We were still barreling along at a white-knuckle speed of 65 to 70 as we passed 72nd without me being able to turn off Indiana. The next road coming up was Leyden Gulch Road, and to my surprise they started to back off. I flicked my blinker without thinking, wanting to get away from them ASAP. But of course they followed me onto the road, continuing to press at my back bumper until we were going at 60 and a 45, with no real street lamps and a lot of curves. I couldn't remember if Leyden Gulch Road went all the way to 93, but I was praying it did when I started to see cones and signs of road work along the side of the road. Suddenly, I saw a road closed sign moved off the left of the road, as if it had been in the middle earlier that day. But I instinctively slowed down, thinking about cartoon characters flying off the edge of a cliff where a bridge used to be. Luckily, the hatchback behind me slowed down too. We slowed down to a reasonable 35, and I thought the danger was over when the road ahead turned to gravel, and suddenly I was driving past mounds of dirt and gravel several times bigger than my car. I tried to make a U-turn, but the piles were too close together, and I ended up horizontal, trapped between 3 piles to either side and behind me. Ever since I'd gotten in front of it, they'd had their brights on, and I couldn't make out a face or license plate. Now, as they drove up the middle of the road perpendicular to me, I was blinded and panicked. I tried to think of what could make them, whoever they were, hesitate or think twice. I settled for looking cocky and almost smirking, eyebrows raised. I'm a girl, so seeing a girl who should be hella freaked out looking amused and self-assured would be weird in this situation. I imagined if I had a gun or some secret weapon up my sleeve, they wouldn't want to mess with me. There was a really long silence, during which I started to wonder, what if they had a gun, and what was going on? Finally, I heard their car door quietly shut. The silence and yelling, or lack of road rage, and explanations freaked me out. So I decided to risk driving my car directly on top of one of the piles, hoping to go slanted up across the side of the pile and around their car. I kept my face locked on a "screw you" kind of face and hit the gas, looking at where I presumed they were the whole time, as I was still pretty blinded and couldn't see much but bright lights or shadows. My car miraculously made it, and I tore out of the dead-end road back onto Indiana Street. I looked for pursuit but didn't see anyone, and made it safely home without seeing many other cars that night. The next day I went back to the area with my brother and sister, and the road closed sign was back across the middle of the road and no longer at the side. I tried to call the police, but it was problematic because I didn't have a lot of useful information beyond that they drove a red hatchback. And also there was a little girl of 10 missing around the same time, Jessica Ridgway. And all resources were on the manhunt. They eventually found her body in Leyden Gulch, but the teen of 19, accused, did not own a red hatchback, so I'm at a loss. I am what I would most certainly call a creep magnet. I get weirdos all the time, and it's become a joke I share with my friends and co-workers, telling them of the many, oh so many creepers I've encountered in my time as a retail employee. I get all kinds of people in my store, and I'm known very well for my bright attitude and overall chipper way of being, which has come to be loved by my regulars and newcomers alike. It's more than likely a contributing factor as to why I get so many weirdos. And my height. I'm a very short girl, standing at 4'8" and looking about 5 years younger than my age of 21. I'm rather filled out for how young I look. That's another reason as well. But on to the story. Today was just like any other. Just another ordinary day working by myself in the store, checking out customers, stocking shelves in my moments away from the register. A normal day. At some point while on register, I greeted a man with a large dark beard, bald and wearing glasses as he came through the door. He immediately smiled and got that surprised look on his face that I've come to know as, "Oh shoot, I'm gonna totally creep on this girl today" look. No biggie, I'm used to it. I know how to handle myself. Eventually, after an hour or two of being on the register, I'd pretty much cleaned the store out of my customers and moved on to stocking candy. The man before with the beard approaches me with a smile and holds up a large, white trash can. Excuse me?" "Yes," I reply, glancing up from the box I'm stocking. "Are there any more of these in the back? This one doesn't have a lid." He says that and gestures to the large trash can in hand. "Oh, yeah, I can check that for you." I smile and am polite, like how I always am, before turning away and heading towards the stockroom. I notice he's following me and think nothing of it, but glance down the aisles for another customer as I walk. Immediately, I take note of the store's emptiness. Ah, damn, it's just us in the store, I think to myself. Moving through the stockroom door, I'm quickly relieved as this guy stops at the entrance. "I'll be right back." I say that as I make a turnaround some full rolltainers, which due to just relieving a truck, our stockroom is full of them. They stand very tall and are like giant movable walls, but very big and heavy, mind you. So being small, I don't have to move them much to make a path through them and see what's on them. So after only a minute, I've made myself a little path, having 3 heavy ones on my right and left in front of me. I decide to give up on my search for trash cans. Sighing, I go to turn around and inform him of my defeat, only to find he's in my tiny path of walls, a very tight squeeze for a man of his stature, standing directly behind me. "Find them?" No, I don't think we have any." I try to laugh and avoid acknowledgement of the creepy situation, but so aware of my surroundings. I'm in a very small area with walls at my back and sides towering over myself, and this very robust man is standing in the way of my only exit, in a room very far from any customers, with no cameras and no other employees at the store. I'm helpless, and increasingly growing scared at how this man isn't moving to let me out. I go to voice that I need to return to work after a solid minute goes by, but I'm not able to get a single word before he says in this creepy, almost shy voice, "You're just the cutest little thing. Did you know that?" Within an instant, I'm scared and feel ill intention from this guy. Oh my god. This is how I die. Surprising myself though, I choke out without hesitation. I just heard my bell. What? He looks confused and doesn't budge. I just heard my bell. There are people up front who need to be checked out and are looking for me. I stand nervously, knowing full well neither of us heard the familiar ching from the service bell that I kept on the register. But what about my trash can? He asks, stepping forward but taking a glance back towards the trash can, and again, with lightning thinking, I blurt out, I'll mark it down to half price. No big deal. Laughing and trying to act like nothing is out of the ordinary, I slip by him, seeing my opening at his turning around, and I try my hardest to walk away, pretending to be calm as I exit the stockroom, then sprint to the front of the store the moment I was out of sight. He wound up leaving without purchasing the trash can. So, creepy guy who I expect to pull something like that again? I hope you and I do not meet again. When I first met the bagman, I was 16. I didn't even think he was anything to worry about at the time. He just passed me by when I was biking around in one of my city's forest preserves called Riverside. Riverside was always a place where I could go when I was feeling stressed or anxious. So when I passed by this rugged-looking guy in the middle of the woods, I didn't think much of it. I had other things on my mind, and for all I know, I could have looked pretty rugged myself, being all sweaty and wearing a black hoodie, and biking around like a maniac. He and I were similarly dressed. I didn't have long to look at him, as I was passing by on my bike pretty quickly, but he was wearing black sweatpants that were ripped in several places, along with muddy white shoes and a black hoodie, which he wore with the hood down. I could also make out that he was a pretty big guy in all areas. He was fairly wide and actually pretty tall. His hair was brown and down to his shoulders. I couldn't really make out his face at the time, but little did I know I would see it in a few weeks. When he saw me coming towards him on my bike, he held up his hand all excitedly and waved at me, and then began to jog while I got closer. I thought at the time that maybe he was out here exercising like me, and seeing me made him remember to start running again or something. But as I passed him, he got so close to my bike that he almost bumped into me. I had to swerve a little to the right to try and avoid him, barely missing him. When I passed him, I kind of heard him shout something back to me, but I couldn't really understand what it was because I had my headphones in. I shrugged at the situation and continued to bike back to my car. It took me a few minutes to get back to the parking lot. I was pretty exhausted as I loaded my bike into the back of the minivan. Once I closed the trunk, I looked around for a moment to see if the guy had been around. I didn't see him, but the only other car that was parked there was directly across from me on the other side of the lot. It was a long, white van, like the stereotypical pedophile van. It was dirty and muddy, like the man driving it, and the windows were tinted so that you couldn't see the inside. Thinking back on this situation now, it could have been totally possible that the bagman followed behind me all the way back into this parking lot and had gotten into his creepy van and was in there while I was staring at that vehicle. He could have been watching me through those dark windows, and I wouldn't have even known. When I pulled out the parking lot, I made sure that the van stayed in its place as I passed by and drove home. That was my first encounter with the bagman. But obviously, That meeting isn't what gave him his name. A little over 3 weeks later, after my experience at the riverside, I was home alone and it was approximately 4 p.m. I was just watching YouTube on my phone while laying in bed upstairs in my room. My dog was next to me, and we were both just chilling until my dad came home from work. While I was up, I go to the bedroom. I heard the doorbell ring, and then 2 loud bangs on the door. Now usually, when there's someone pounding on the door like that, it's almost always my mum, because she, for some reason, likes to freak out the dog when she gets home, and a few loud bangs on the door would do just the trick. So my dog went running out of my room and tore down the steps to the front door. I followed behind him, but didn't really feel like running. When I finally get to the door, I swung it open, fully expecting to see my mum, but it wasn't her. It was the guy from Riverside. He was just staring at me with this big black garbage bag in his hand. He was wearing almost the exact same outfit that he was wearing when I saw him last, except his shoes, which were now all clean. I looked up at his face and saw that he had a poorly trimmed beard that covered almost all of it. His eyes were a bright blue, and they stared down at me. He spoke before I had a chance to say anything. Now this will be a rough paraphrase of what he said, but it's something like this. "Hi there, young man. Is Melanie around? I'd love to see her." No, I don't know who that is." "Sorry." I actually knew who she was, because she lived a few houses down. Not that I wanted to tell this guy. I think at this point I had given him a smile to try and act like I wasn't completely freaked out. You see, I always park my minivan right outside my house, so it's always in view whenever I'm home. This means that he probably recognized it and me. "I think I know you from somewhere, pal." His voice was deep and haunting, and just kind of left me stunned. I stood there and didn't say anything, shrugged my shoulders, and that's when he started to shake the bag. I didn't really know how else to describe it. He was just shaking the bag up and down. I never actually saw what was inside, but it sounded like a whole bunch of metal cookie cutters rattling around. The contents were poking and stretching, and the bag was out at weird angles. He was just staring at me as he shook the bag and inched closer. "Are you sure you don't know where Melanie is?" He continued to shake the bag as he encroached on my space until we were nearly touching. My breath was shaky, and I was looking down at the ground like a dog that had just gotten into trouble for peeing on the couch. Then I snapped and pushed him away from me as hard as I could. His skin was flabby and soft, and his shirt felt greasy. I used all my strength to get him away from me. I didn't look back as I did a 180 and sped back into my house, slamming the door, and once I was back inside, I could hear him pound his heavy arms against the door and the clamoring of whatever was in the bag. He banged on the door for maybe 30 seconds before he stopped abruptly. I quickly sped towards the window to see if he was still wandering there, and I moved to the side to get a better angle of the doorway. I saw him looking back at me. When we met eyes, he immediately started running back to his van, which was parked across the street. I recognized that it was the same one from the riverside. I was disappointed to see that there weren't any front license plate numbers, but as the van started to move and pass my house, I took down the number and letters that were on the back of the van, and I still have them written down on my phone. Since that incident, I haven't seen the man since, and I notified Melanie that some man was asking around for her. She said she had no idea who it might be, but would tell her parents just so that they could keep a lookout too. After about a year, my mum and I were having lunch, and she was scrolling through Facebook when she came upon a post from a woman that lived in a state neighbouring ours. The woman wrote that a man driving a white van drove up to her house and knocked on the door, which her youngest daughter answered. The man had apparently asked her to get into his van because he had the circus in there. Apparently the mum came to the door before anything happened. Apparently the man was still being really creepy. Unfortunately, the woman didn't post a description of the name or the man, but she definitely remembers the white van. Now, I don't know exactly what the critics mean. Now, I don't know exactly what the circus means, but I'm almost positive it's the same man that visited my house, and I'm pretty sure he's still out there preying on people. Because just yesterday, the local news said that they interviewed a 9-year-old girl that was approached by a man driving a white van. So please, if you live in central Illinois in the US, watch out for anyone matching the description. You may find him. Every time I stay at my grandma's house, I hear someone walking upstairs. It starts at one side of the room, casually walks to the other, and stops. This will happen maybe twice a night. I didn't start hearing it until I was about 14, when my grandparents made me start sleeping in the different room on the first floor, because they were starting to sleep in separate bedrooms. Regardless, both of their rooms are also on the first floor. For a little backstory, I have always been afraid of the upstairs of the house. I don't know why, but it's always freaked me out, and I refuse to ever go up there alone. I'm 23 now, and still won't go up there alone. There's one room specifically, though it's a long, narrow bedroom. When you open the door, there's a closet on the left and right, with a bed placed roughly in the middle of the room, and a window on the far side opposite the door. I was told while I was growing up, by my grandparents, that the sons of the previous owner claimed to see a gorilla coming out of the closet at night. It would dance around the room and then go back into the closet. I thought nothing of this story until I had to start sleeping in the other room. The room which was located directly below the scary room upstairs. So we all go to bed. All the lights in the house are off, and I'm still awake, lying on the bed. Then I heard it. Thump, thump, thump. Starting at one end of the room upstairs. It got closer to me, passed right above me, and continued to the end of the room where it stopped. I'm wide awake, terrified out of my mind. It was no question to me that I had heard footsteps. I knew that slow, casual pace. I was freaked out and went to my grandpa's room. I told him what I'd heard, and he told me the house is old and that it creaks. He turned the dining room light on for me, so that I felt a little safer, and I tried going back to sleep. Then it started again, this time from where it ended the first time, by the window upstairs. It walks over to me again and stops when it reached the door. I thought it was over until 5 seconds later, when I heard it coming down the stairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Silence as it reached the landing. Then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And silence again as it reached the first floor. I was frozen in shock. Whatever it was on my floor of the house, and sadly unaffected by the dining room light. I was staring at the doorway to my room. The dining room light was shining in, and my vision began to distort. I felt dizzy with fear, so I pulled the blankets over my head, and suddenly I heard a scratching sound from inside my room. I knew exactly where it was coming from. My grandpa's gun case. It was a very obvious sound, scratching on the wood. Long scratches down the front of the gun case door. I could even hear the door ever so slightly tapping against the frame as each scratch began. I tried to scream, and I couldn't. I took a second to take a deep breath and let out a loud scream. In seconds, my grandpa had made it to my room, and I was relieved. Needless to say, he didn't believe me, so I did what any normal person would do. I draped a sheet over the side of the bed and slept underneath it. I wrapped myself tight in a comforter, put on headphones, and turned my back to the door. There could be a party of ghosts in my room, and I wouldn't even know. The next morning, my grandpa told my grandma about what happened the night before. She said, "Oh, that's silly. You know, your cousin woke up the last time she stayed here. She came in my room saying that she heard footsteps. I ended up sleeping under the bed for the rest of my stay. I've stayed there countless times since that happened, and I hear the footsteps every time. I sleep on top of the bed now, but keep my back to the door and sleep with my headphones on. I haven't heard it come down the stairs since that first night, but if it does, I don't want to know." This story is not really about me, but about my younger sister and my relationship with her. We are very close, and she means the world to me. I have 2 younger twin brothers, but I'm not as close with them as I am with her. Anyway, before I begin my story, I have to provide some context about our lives. We grew up in a very Christian household. No, not the church every Sunday, and no cursing kind of Christians. I mean the go to church twice a week, a cross in every room, and daily prayer kind of Christian household. Needless to say, religion was a big thing in our family. I grew up around, mostly, my family, and didn't really have too many friends growing up, because my family preferred me hanging around with people who were in our religion. I'm not going to say which religion we are, because not everyone is like my family in our religion. I don't like putting people in bubbles like my family had me believe. Anyway, the kids we did get to hang around with were kids of my own religion, and luckily we got to go to school with them, and also normal kids. A lot of kids in my church did go to public school because it was the closest, and there wasn't a school directly for my religion in our county at the time. So my sister and I were very sheltered and awkward kids. We weren't allowed to do many after-school activities, and the ones we could do were more about academics like math club and chess club, and of course, Kids for Christ. Like I said before, me and my sister were rarely allowed to hang out with kids outside our religion without supervision. But when we did hang around other kids of our faith, we made the most of it, especially since some of those kids were actually doing things against our religion, like doing drugs, sleeping with other kids in the church, cursing, and I can tell you many stories about me and my sister getting high and other cool stuff, but that's for another time. In fact, in the beginning, I even tattled on a few of them when I was in middle school, because it was drilled into me that they were going to hell if I did not. and so was I for keeping it a secret. Yeah, I had a lot of that stuff drilled into me. So most of what me and my sister learnt about the world outside our church was either from those cool kids or from Reddit and the internet. We had a family computer, and it had to be in the living room. Me and my sister had to use it in public to make sure we weren't using it for anything dubious. Sometimes me and my sister would go out to the living room at 2 a.m. and just go on websites that we weren't allowed to be on, like Reddit, Facebook, or watch funny videos. We didn't even have smartphones, because they were kind of just starting to pick up, and we weren't allowed to have them. So that's why we would do that. Sometimes we'd get caught from laughing out loud and get lectured by our father, but those are still some of my favorite memories with my sister. Enough backstory though. On to what happened. As I said before, me and my sister were both extremely close. We could tell each other anything, which is why it warmed and broke my heart when she came out to me as gay at age 17. I feel guilty because I said she was just confused, but I knew I was wrong. I hugged her and cried with her because I could only imagine the pressure and guilt and pain she was going through. Of course, we never told our family and kept it a secret. Being gay is something that is not accepted in our religion, so my sister wanted to get away from our family to some place where she could just be herself. When she graduated high school a year before I did, she begged my parents to go to a university she wanted. My parents told us that after high school we could either go to a community college or a university that was run by people of our religion, like a Catholic school or something. However, with enough convincing that we were good kids with Christ in our hearts, my parents let her go to the university she wanted, under the strict rules which I will get to later. I went to community college to get my general eds done, and then my parents let me do the same as my sister. I decided to go to a school in New York City called Columbia University, and my sister decided to go to a university called UCLA, which was a university in Los Angeles, California. I guess those extracurricular activities paid off. Although me and my sister were on opposite sides of the country, we were still able to communicate, because our parents let us have our own computers and Samsung Galaxy S4s, with the exception of being forced to download the app Life 360. If you don't know what it is, it's an app that allows your family members to see where you are based on the GPS in your phone. So we had to be careful where we went, or at least leave our phones at home in our dorms when we went out and partied at night. My sister and I would constantly talk about college life and how amazing it was to be away from the strict household. We could be free and do whatever we wanted. On Skype, she gave all the details about her life and told me things like about how extremely gay-friendly California was, and she even had a girlfriend now, and told me how open she can be about her sexuality. Unfortunately, she may have been a little too open. Let me explain. At home, we were constantly told to suppress sexual urges, so my sister just let hers all out while she was at college. She told me stories on Skype about how she was polyamorous, so she could date more than one person at once and had multiple girlfriends. I didn't get it, but she said she would sometimes want to experiment with toys, other gays, and straight couples, and would even sometimes bring 1 to 3 women, including her girlfriend of the time, back to the fraternity house and let all their urges run wild. I wasn't a fan of listening to those stories and thought she was making a lot of those stories up. But of course it's my sister. I did it anyway because I told her she could tell me anything. However, one experience is the one I'm telling you about now. One morning, I get a call at 2 a.m. and had to walk out into the hall because I didn't want to wake up my roommates. It was my sister. She was crying hysterically, and I could barely make out her words through her sobbing. "Just calm down. Tell me what's wrong." She responded that she was being stalked and harassed and didn't know what to do, nor who else to call. I told her to call the police. She told me that she couldn't, and I was confused and asked her to tell me what was going on. Apparently, the story goes like this. One day at university, my sister met this girl, April, and asked April if she wanted to be part of her polyamorous thing, or whatever it was. Apparently, they hit it off really well and had a really good connection. About a week or two into their relationship, my sister asked April if she wanted to come back to her dorm to watch Netflix and hang out. They did, but my sister's other girlfriend stopped by to pick up something she left at her dorm. My sister gave her a kiss goodbye, and when April saw this, she was kind of mad. She was upset because she thought she shouldn't do that when they're in the same room, or some other bullshit like that. And apparently they got into a fight. They made up and eventually got back together. Then my sister started noticing suspicious things about April for the past few months. April would constantly call and text her non-stop, get jealous when she was with another woman, and stuff like that. At one time, my sister received 48 texts from April while she was in class, and couldn't answer because she was taking a test. "Where are you? Why aren't you answering? You better not be with another woman. Why don't you love me?" Crazy texts like that. That was the final straw for my sister, and she broke it off with April, who didn't take it well. My sister told me about April in the past, but I just thought nothing of it. Just people being crazy, I guess, right? However, my sister started seeing April everywhere she went. She saw her when she was walking to class, at the front of her dorm when she got out, in the cafeteria, messages on social media. It was insane. My sister threatened to call campus security on April, and that did seem to scare her off for a while, but that would only last so long. Fast forward to fall semester of 2015, and my sister starts to hear from April again. Only this time, things got worse. April would go around to women my sister was supposedly dating, and tell them that she was my sister's fiancé or girlfriend, or even she had an STD, and they should stay away from her or else. My sister even started receiving threats from April via social media accounts. I swear this girl was insane. My sister was terrified, to say the least. She called campus security and just asked her to watch out, that she doesn't try and come into the same dorm building and to not make a big deal about it, and I'll explain why in a second. One night, my sister and her roommate come back into their dorms, and my sister noticed the door was open. They were sure that they had locked it. They came back, and the room looked fine, but there was a note on my sister's bed. What it said still scares both of us to this day. Like a cliché horror movie, the note read, "If I can't have you in my life, no one can. Never go near another woman, or else I know where you live." My sister just started crying and showed her roommates the letter. They were in utter shock, and also through her tears, she noticed one thing was missing. Her purse was gone. Her purse had a lot of important stuff in it. Her wallet, which had her license, debit cards, some dead gift cards, and other unimportant stuff. But luckily her phone and computer were still there charging under the bed. And after that, she immediately called me. Now I know what you're thinking. Why didn't she call campus security or the police? Well, here's the reason. Usually when situations occur on college campuses and the police have to get involved, guess who else might possibly receive a call? That's right, our parents. And if they found out about April and my sister, there's a good chance my sister would have worse to worry about at home. I've been told by people that technically the school or police can't call your parents without your permission, but my sister was too afraid to take the risk. That would be a hard thing to keep secret. The only thing we could do right now would be to cancel the debit cards and ask for new ones from the bank. Luckily, April didn't use them, because all the money was still there in her account. That was the only thing we had to explain to our parents. She just said that she may have accidentally left her wallet at Starbucks or something, and they were even worried just about that. As for her driver's license, I don't know what to do besides look up or Google how to get a new one, but she did end up getting a newer one later. So for the next few months, my sister was on constant lookout, but luckily she didn't hear from April in a while. We weren't sure if it was just because maybe she lost interest, or maybe because she was planning something, but we didn't care. That didn't mean my sister was still nervous. My sister always double checks the area she was in, and made sure to be aware of her surroundings. She even went to the official college safe spot, and yes, those exist. Luckily, she didn't turn into one of the social justice warriors I keep hearing about. Anyway, she did hear from April a couple of times, but they were just messages from fake profiles on Facebook. She couldn't prove that they were her, but we knew they were. Who else would those messages be from? So luckily my sister never heard from her for a while. However, that wouldn't last too long. Like I said before, our parents had a tracking app on our phone, and often, our parents would just call us to see how we were doing, or why we were somewhere. So a lot of the time we just left our phones at our dorm. My sister told me through Skype that she heard from April again, when she brought a girl back from a party to her dorm to fool around. After they were done, she noticed she received a text from a random number about an hour ago. It read, "Bring another whore back to your dorm? I knew you were a slut." She said she was terrified. I told her April was probably just at the party because a lot of people were there, but make sure to still be on the lookout. A day or two later, I'm laying in bed watching my favorite movie with my girlfriend at the time, when I get a call from a blocked number. I knew I shouldn't have answered it, but I did anyway. I answered, "Hello?" And in a low voice I heard, "Hi. I bet you didn't know your sister was a little whore, right?" "Excuse me?" I say, and the person on the phone replied, "Yeah, a worthless little whore," and then just hung up. Needless to say, I was pissed off and confused, and my girlfriend could see it. She asked what was wrong, and I told her. I had to walk out and call my sister. I knew it was April, and I don't know how she got my number, but she did. I called her and told her not to panic. I told her to please be careful and to always carry mace or a stun gun or something, because we were stuck and we didn't know what else to do. Seeing her back home during Thanksgiving was such a relief, but I could see the effects that April and college stress had on her. The stress of finals were already killing us, and now we had this to worry about? Luckily, April didn't call my sister or I again for the last month, and things were quiet. Fast forward to December and all of our finals were done. We were both back at home with our parents and brothers, and glad to be home. We did, however, miss the freedom that we had at college. Whenever we came home from college, it went from freedom to go and do what you want to only using the computer in the living room and being home by 10 p.m. We spent the last few days either talking, going to church, relaxing, or texting our friends. And yes, we got to keep the phones. Christmas came, and I wish I could say it was a relaxing one, but it wasn't. First came church, then of course volunteering at the soup kitchen, which is something I actually like about my church, and then dinner with family. It was a lot, but in the end my family brought us new clothes and about $500 in cash and gift cards, so I'd say it was a good Christmas. Everything was peaceful, or so I thought. Fast forward a week or two. It was a cold Wednesday morning and my father was awake. He usually wakes up early because he enjoys drinking coffee in peace while watching TV or reading literature our church hands out. I was just starting to wake up when he calls me and my siblings downstairs in a not good tone of voice. We sat down on the couch and my mum was there as well. They looked furious, and we were all a little nervous and confused. What was going on? My father was looking through the mail and found a letter with a return address he didn't recognize and under the name Jane Doe. When he showed us what was inside, I couldn't believe what I saw. In his hand were printed out pictures of my sister from her private Facebook account. They were pictures of my sister either partying or kissing with every girl my sister was dating within that 2-year period. My sister's face turned as white as a ghost, and me and her must have shat bricks when he showed us. My father stared at my sister and said in the sternest tone possible, "What are these?" Before any of us could get a word out, he yelled it again. I was dumbfounded and terrified. My sister began to break out into tears. I was just sitting there and wondered, how the hell? And then I remembered. April had my sister's original driving license when she stole her purse. April must have copied pictures from my sister's Facebook account and sent them home. But I didn't understand how the hell she could have gotten those photos because her Facebook was private. April and her were friends for about a month, but she unfriended her and some photos were from after she blocked her. I didn't know how, but it didn't matter. What made it worse was on the back of the photos it read, "I know where you live." All I could remember was my father screaming, and my sister and mother were crying, and me and my brothers were just sitting there in shock. My sister confessed everything about her and April, and my parents were furious to say the least. My father walked up to me and my brothers and asked, "Did any of you know about this?" My 2 brothers legitimately didn't, and they answered no. My father walked up to me and asked if I knew, and like a dog, with the tail in between his legs, I responded, "No, I didn't." He looked me dead in the eyes and said, "People who keep other sins a secret and lie about it burn in hellfire. So I'm going to ask you one last time, did you know?" Once again I responded, "No, I didn't, Dad." I could see my sister just in shock through her tears that I didn't defend her. I still see her shocked face in my nightmares. How could I not stand up for my baby sister, my best friend, my flesh and blood, when she needed it the most? In the end, my father gave her an ultimatum. Either my sister went to conversion therapy, which yes, is still a thing in my state, or she leaves the house. Also, there's no way she was going to be allowed back into UCLA. My sister kept saying that she didn't need therapy, and begged our parents to accept her for who she was, but that didn't happen. In the end, my father kicked her out of the house, and me and my brothers were furious with them. When confronting my parents and yelling how could they do this, my mother and father kept justifying their actions by saying she chose to sin against God, and it put our family in danger. And if you're wondering why my parents didn't call the police, well, here's why. A lot of our neighbors and people in our community went to the same church. If one neighbor saw police cars at our house, someone would get suspicious, and someone would find out what happened. Word would spread through my church like wildfire, and my parents would be looked at differently and with contempt by everyone at church. My parents cared more about their reputation in our church than the safety and security of their own daughter. I never looked at my parents in the same way again. Luckily, a distant friend who left our church was able to take her in, although the spring semester of UCLA was already paid for. There was no way for her to get there or support herself while there, so she never got to go back. My parents told me to cut off communication with her, but there was no way that was ever going to happen. They threatened to either not let me go back to school or kick me out, but I was able to find my way around them. My sister told me that she forgave me for not standing up for her, because she understands I was scared and it wasn't my fault. She said she kept blaming herself, but I kept telling her that there's nothing wrong with her. My parents never should have done what they did. I'm currently still with my parents and have another year until I graduate with my electrical engineering degree. My sister is still currently living with my friend, but she's got a job and a girlfriend, and they're a beautiful couple. When I move out, you're damn right I'm not going back to church. Not because I hate our church, but because I know it will make my parents angry, and they can't threaten me then. So to my sister, if you're listening to this, please know I love you, and I will always be there for you. Luckily, we never heard from April again. And if you're hearing this, April, I hope you understand that you ruined the life of an amazing young woman who was stuck in the closet. And rather than sympathize with someone on your own side, you made the life of a closeted gay person harder. So April, I hope you rot in hell for what you did to my family. Sophomore year of my undergrad career, I took a class that was quite challenging, and 90% PhD students, because my dean suggested it, in place of a typical econ class. I thought it would be cool to be challenged by such a class, which I was, but I also had the unfortunate encounter with a PhD student who actively tried to ask girls to paint their faces. It was a very small evening class, maybe 10 of us in a small room. I'm very shy, and everyone was older than me, so I didn't talk to anyone at all. Very soon after the semester started, I got a Facebook friend request. It's one of the PhD students. I thought it would be useful to have contact in such difficult classes. He had different motives for adding me though. Note, we hadn't spoken or even greeted each other in real life. His first message to me read, "Quick, how do you feel about face paint?" I ask what he means, and he sends me some Google images from Day of the Dead face paint, as well as some Juggalo stuff. He then asks me if he can paint my face, and then sends a question mark. I don't reply for 20 minutes, and finally say, "I think I'll pass." He goes on to add, "Why? Sad face," and follows with, "Still no luck in the face department. Sad face." A week later. So at this point, I'm actively ignoring someone that I have to be in a small room with 2 times a week. Maybe that sounds harsh, or like I'm being presumptuous, besides just trying to protect myself as a young woman. That's because at the same time, an app called Yik Yak was very popular for college students. It's basically a totally anonymous forum where people at respective campuses say anything they want. While browsing, I find a thread of someone complaining about a dude who was persistently asking to paint their face. A few other people join in the comments and say they've encountered the same person, and naturally, I join in the conversation. This leads me to find the dude is posting on the app himself as well. He is very tactlessly using the same account to both ask girls to paint their face and also impersonate girls and pretend to praise the great work he did on their faces. The weirdest thing I saw him post was a photo of some naive undergrad in the dorms with her face painted, and bragging about how they made out after he did it. This guy does not try to be subtle, and joins those incoming class Facebook groups asking freshmen if he can paint their face. At this point in time, he was infamous, and my friend told me about the posts in those groups. I should also mention that he was allegedly in a relationship the entire time he was posting in those groups. I would totally like to believe that this is some hobby of his that he genuinely wants to have an outlet for, but his behavior on Yik Yak suggests that it does something more for him. He also seemed to target young freshman girls, specifically, and in my opinion, thinks it comes off as innocent, when in fact it's not. I had a class in the same building later in my college career, in which he has an office, and I would hope with all my might that we would not meet again, knowing he was a huge weirdo who probably resented me. I'm in the don't believe in ghosts category of people, but I have an experience that I just simply can't explain, and I have tried for over a decade. I had been homeless for a while, having fled an abusive home when I was 17. My friend had an abandoned trailer, so I started sleeping in there. At first, I didn't have money to turn on the utilities, so I slept there and just turned them on one by one. It's significant to this story because it meant that there were no creaky pipes and no hum of electricity. Almost right away, I started hearing strange noises, what sounded like footsteps down the hall and in the kitchen, and cabinet doors opening and closing. At night, when I would leave for work, which would be the 3rd shift, I would pull on the door and crank the key. By the time I got out to the car, I would hear a click, and the lock would be undone. Figuring I was retarded at locking the deadbolt, but it spooked me, and I would just take off every time. About a week goes by, and I get paid at work, so I begin turning on utilities. I'm a girl, so naturally water and the telephone have to come first. Well, one night, I'm on the phone with the girl that inherited the trailer, and I hear the footsteps again. I had stopped talking and she asked what was wrong, and I joked that the trailer was haunted, and I'll never forget her words in response to this. "Don't worry, she is friendly." She proceeded to tell me about an old lady that died there. I flipped the hell out, and she insisted that she was safe. Somehow I convinced my friend and her 2-year-old daughter to move in with me, and things just got weirder. The little girl would play with something unseen in the kitchen, the cat would purr and play with something in the kitchen. If she was screaming and crying in her room, one of us would get up to check on her to find her giggling and talking to someone. When we were drinking or smoking pot, things started acting up. The cabinets would open, things would fall out of them, and we would be very creeped out. The final straw was one night when I was with some dude in the living room. There was a back door that was attached to the living room. We opened it once but never used it because we didn't have a key for it. Right in the middle of us doing it, it swings open so hard that it slams into the side of the trailer. I thought for sure it was a tornado or something. I wrap the sheet around myself and go to close the door, as it was completely still outside. That and the deadbolt were from what scared me the most. In order to lock the front door, you had to pull the door shut, or push from the inside, and it took significant effort to turn the key to deadbolt it. Why did it keep propping open? The cabinets? Well, I kept figuring maybe the trailer was tilted or something, but they had the little magnets that kept them from closing. So, I just don't know. True crime was, and is, one of my favorite genres of entertainment. I loved reading about serial killers and stalkers, and things like that, because none of it had ever touched my life personally. But since this happened, it's become much less rooted in fantasy, and I'm looking out for red flags. During my sophomore year in college, I was a volunteer teaching assistant for an on-campus international student program in the Northeast. Basically, it was the last step students had to take to get a certificate telling potential schools and employers, I can speak English really well, and here's proof. The students tended to come in groups selected by programs in their home countries. So one semester we might have a lot of Chinese and Brazilian students, and the next a whole bunch of Koreans and Saudi Arabians. This particular semester there were a lot of people from Mexico, and they all lived in an off-campus housing complex called the Suites. Now, my position. As I've said, I was a volunteer. I had some friends from the program in the past, and they knew I wanted to teach English abroad. So they put in a good word with me for the staff, so that I could get some practical skills and experience under my belt. Being as informal an arrangement as it was, I had no qualms about forming personal relationships with the students. In fact, a few of us are still good friends today. I wasn't a very outgoing person at the time, and though I had many friends, I hardly ever drank and had never been to a party. Hearing this, the Mexican students who threw parties every weekend insisted that I come to the next one. The party was fun and comprised almost exclusively of international students, which was nice because I knew most of them. I got really drunk and had fluent conversations in languages I had very loose grasps on. Everything was going great, until a few of us retreated into a friend's dorm for some air. Checking their phones, a few girls realized that Pamela had not returned from Main Street yet, and no one can get a hold of her. Pamela was a 19-year-old Mexican student and had gone to a local eatery after lessons that day in order to meet one of the teachers for a private tutoring session. The session was scheduled for 5 p.m. and should not have gone longer than 7:30. It was 11:30 at this point, and the girls were, understandably, worried. I asked which teacher the tutoring session was with, and they told me it was with Charles. Immediately my skin crawled. There were about 5 teachers at the facility, and Charles was by far the sketchiest. He was around 40 years old, half American, half Japanese, with short but visibly flat-ironed black hair that partially covered his glasses. He honestly looked like a stereotypical weirdo. I tried to hop around between classrooms on a weekly basis to get a feel for different teaching methods, but I cut my week with Charles short because he was just so creepy. The way he spoke to his students was condescending and mildly inappropriate, commenting on a girl's blouse or telling risque stories about his own wild college years and how they ought to take a leaf out of his book. All of this in the middle of a class, mind you. Additionally, he would always get uncomfortably close to the Latina students, grabbing their shoulders, touching the smalls of their back, and even grazing their breasts occasionally. He crept me out, as well as everyone else. After sharing some creepy Charles stories, we were all freaked out and ready to do something. Last anyone had heard from Pam was at 5:15, when she texted and said her phone was about to die, but she would figure out a way home when the tutoring was complete. It was the middle of winter in northeastern US, and a blizzard warning was in effect. The diner she was at was a 3-mile walk from the suites, and a few girls suggested she was bunkering down until the warning let up. The problem was, that could be days. Another theory was that she got lost trying to find her way home and was now in the snow. None of us had a car, so we told a few of the boys and they formed a search party and started walking to Main Street. Just a few minutes later, they returned with a snow-covered Pamela in their midst. Being from Mexico, none of these people had packed properly for a brutal winter, so when they found her she was freezing and soaked to the bone. After a hot shower and relaxing for a bit, she told us in Spanish what had happened. When she arrived at the diner, Charles was nowhere to be found. She waited for 40 minutes and was just about to leave, knowing that a storm was coming, when he finally showed up. He apologized and said that he was just upstairs and had dozed off. He lived in the upstairs apartment, you see, and asked if she wouldn't mind taking the lesson there where it was more quiet. Being a shy, somewhat reserved person who spoke little English, she complied. When upstairs, he started asking her all sorts of questions about herself. Most she could barely answer. And when she stumbled, he would laugh and chastise her for her mistakes. I used to work in a hole-in-the-wall gas station out in the sticks of North Carolina. I was freshly 18 and had a new car, a crappy Chev, but it got me from point A to B, and was newly promoted to assistant manager. So I was working many late nights by myself. Truthfully, I loved working alone. My boss was super laid back, and his philosophy was, as long as the work gets done, do whatever you please. And we had a shotgun behind the counter, which he taught me to shoot on the first day there. So even though I would be there so late, I always felt safe. On this particular night, it was extremely dead. So, with my boss's permission, I closed the store early and hopped into my car. It was probably 11:30 to 12 a.m. at this point. Other than being able to get out of work so early, this was my usual routine. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I texted my roommate to let her know I was arriving early, as we always looked out for each other like that. I lit up a cigarette, then started on my way home. For those of you who don't know North Carolina like I do, I'm going to provide a little bit of detail regarding the terrain. From where I worked at the gas station to where I lived, I had to drive down the back roads. Those roads consisted of very dense wood on both sides. Sometimes the woods would seem so thick, you really couldn't tell where you were, especially at night. This could be intimidating to those who don't know the area, but honestly I was more worried about deer jumping out in front of me, which was a common occurrence in this area. But on this night, I wished it were just a deer. I was driving down the road, blaring Nirvana, which was my favorite band at the time, and just being a typical 18-year-old grunge kid who had newly discovered the freedom of being an adult and getting off work, when all of a sudden, I see something in the middle of the road, probably 75 to 100 feet away. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it looked too small to be a deer, so I started to gradually slow down, ultimately coming to a stop. I have to wear glasses when I drive, mainly at night, but my eyesight isn't terrible enough for me to make it a habit. I grabbed my glasses and put them on. Now being able to see much more clearly, I almost shat myself when I saw it. It was a woman, an older woman, wearing what looked like a nightgown of some kind. Her hair was in disarray. She had her hands behind her back and was just standing there in the middle of the road, just staring at my car. Let me remind you, we are practically in the middle of nowhere. There are trees as far as my headlights can shine, and it's midnight. I'm naturally paranoid, so all sorts of questions were running through my head. Who is this woman? Where did she come from? It's midnight. Are my doors locked? Why is she out here at midnight? Should I honk my horn at her? Should I call the police? What if she has Alzheimer's and doesn't know where she is? Or what if she's an escaped mental patient? Even though the closest mental facility was only 3 to 4 cities away, I didn't exclude that possibility. I thought about calling 911, but I get my phone and, of course, no cell service. This encounter went on for a while, just sitting there in the middle of the road, mentally questioning what to do. It's now way past midnight and she's still standing there, just staring at me with this zoned out look and her hands behind her back, as if she were observing me. I started to get tired of this. Considering that I had to be up early for work the next morning, I honked my horn at her. I didn't expect what happened next. This woman's face turns from being spaced out to complete rage. Then she raises her arms up, and it looked like she was holding something in her hand. She lets out this horrid guttural scream and charges at my car. As she ran closer, I realized she was holding something sharp. It looked like a kitchen knife or a piece of jagged glass. During this moment of horror, I had a brief flashback to my stepdad giving me advice when I first got my license. If an animal ever runs in front of you, turn it into a bump. I love animals, so I couldn't bear to hear that. But at the time, I was taking my stepdad's advice. I was going to turn this woman into a bump. Serve the Servants by Nirvana comes on next, and I mention this because this song has much to do with the aura of that moment. As if I were in sync with the instance of time, the intensity of this song enables me to let out the most intimidating primal scream that I could, loud enough for her to hear me. The window was open because I had been smoking, and I hit the gas. She was running towards my car like she was going to jump on my hood. I guess she realized I had the utmost intent to hit her, at which point this woman zigzags away from my car and runs off into the woods. Still in flight mode, I didn't question where this woman went. I was just glad that she was gone. So I accelerated on the gas and sped the entire way home. I got home at almost 1:30 a.m. My roommate was still awake, waiting up for me the entire time. She was extremely worried for me, because it was way past the time I said I was going to be home. She had been texting and calling me when I pulled up to the house, and I got all of her texts and missed calls at once. So I started to explain to her what happened. My body went from fight mode to panic, as I was recounting everything that had occurred. My roommate's aunt was a 911 operator, who also happened to be working that night. So she decided to text her aunt to see if there were any silver alerts in the area. Immediately her aunt texted back and said there weren't. That alone gave me goosebumps to the core of my being. There was no explanation as to where this lady came from. So deranged lady who tried to attack me in the middle of the woods in North Carolina? Let's not meet. And if we do, per my stepdad's timely advice, I will turn you into a bump. 11 years ago, before my wife and I got married, we were trying to save a bit of money before the wedding, and so were living with my mum. My wife was working at the hospital in the city next to the beach. She worked 12-hour shifts, and I worked 10-hour shifts. On my days off, if she had to work, I would take her and pick her up, because the hospital wasn't in the best part of the city, and staff had to ride a trolley to and from the parking lot to the hospital. So, one evening we get home. My aunt and uncle had come in from out of town to visit. My wife smoked at the time, and so did my uncle and aunt. We're all sitting outside with them talking, when suddenly my wife goes quiet, staring towards the end of the driveway. She slowly takes her cigarette, which she just lit, and snuffs it out, looks at me and goes, "I've had enough. I'm going inside." She stands up and goes in without another word. I stood up and asked her what was wrong, but she just continued without looking back. What she didn't know at the time is that I already knew what it was. Because when I looked down the driveway, standing there was the figure of a woman that I had seen many times before, just staring at us. She had mid-length curly brown hair, wearing a white nightgown with a blue robe. She always seemed to come when new people were there. From time to time, she would come into our room and just stare at us, but my wife had never seen her. I go inside and ask my wife to come back out, and at first she refused to, but eventually gave in and came back out. I had never mentioned this apparition to her, so I was curious what she saw, so I started asking her to tell me. At first, she said that she was tired and wanted to go inside, but I saw her too, so I wanted to verify if we had seen the same thing. Finally, I just bluntly said, "Honey, what did it look like?" She looks at me and her face goes white all over again. And she said, "If you want to look for yourself, she's by the truck." Shivers went up my spine, but I had to stay calm. I asked her to describe her to me. Her voice was shaky, but she said brown curly hair, white gown, and blue robes. I had to keep myself from jumping out of my skin. It was the exact same figure that I had seen multiple times. I told her it's okay, and that I see her from time to time as well, and that she means no harm. My wife looks at me and said I don't care if she does or doesn't. We're leaving here as soon as we can, because I don't want to see her again. From that day, we left a few months after, and never saw her again. I like to think that maybe she was just protecting my mum, who still lives there with my sister and her family to this day. She wasn't the only ghost at the house, as my sister and her family have witnessed things, but they haven't seen the brown-haired lady in quite some time. Growing up, we didn't have a lot of money, and we didn't always live in the best neighborhoods. When I was 10, my parents got a great deal on this house that was in an okay neighborhood. They got a 3-bedroom, 2-bath for barely $100K, and for another 10, they got all the furniture inside of it. This kind of deal is basically unheard of in this city. The reason it was dirt cheap is because the current person who lived in it was 40 years old and mentally unstable, and had the mentality of a child. His parents died, in the house by the way. The dad had a heart attack in the living room, and the mother died in her sleep in the master bedroom. He was going to be put in a state care facility because he couldn't take care of himself. The guy took a suitcase full of stuff with him, and the rest was ours. This house was a fixer-upper for sure, and they weren't kidding about his mental state. This guy was a pack rat borderline hoarder. The house had old cereal boxes that expired in the 80s, and this was the 2000s. There were 3 large garbage bags full of old mail, a mountain of pennies on the dining room table. If I had to guess how many there were, I'd say about $300 worth. There was so much dust and dirt, we thought the wall was beige when they were white. The grossest thing we found was in the garage. There was a whipped cream container that was halfway filled with cockroaches and cut in half. On top of that, the guy was a creep. Apparently he would sit in the dining room and count pennies for hours while staring at the next door neighbors through the window. They have small kids, and this freaked them out so much they put up a fence and a hedge. It took us 4 months to sort out the junk from the antiques and fix up the house. On September 11th, 2001, a year later, I was in 6th grade. I went to my first 2 classes like normal. When I got to my 3rd class, an announcement was made over the intercom, and every single kid in my class was to be picked up early except me. Me and the teacher had no idea what happened, why everyone left, and why I wasn't picked up too. The teacher let me use her phone to call my parents while she went to the office to find out what was going on. My mum was at work and didn't answer, and my dad worked nights, so he was at home in the day, and I just called my house phone. "Dad, what's going on? Everyone in class got picked up early." "What do you mean everyone went home early?" My teacher wheeled in a TV and puts on the news as the 2nd tower got hit. "Put on the news, something's happening, please come get me." "Hold on, someone's at the door." I hear my dad yelling at someone. It was hard to make out the words, and then my dad gets back onto the phone. "I can't pick you up now." He's back. "Who?" "You know the guy that used to own the house? I gotta go call the cops." "What?" And then the phone went off. Being 11, I was terrified. To me, World War III was starting, and a crazy guy might be trying to kill my family. My dad never called back, and no one came to pick me up. When I finally did get home, my dad told me that the guy said that this was his house, and that my dad needed to leave. My dad told him that this is his house, and that if he doesn't leave, he was calling the cops. This triggered the guy to start screaming nonsense, hitting himself, and my dad locked the door and called the cops. When they showed up, he started yelling about how it was his house, that his mum was inside, and that my dad was kidnapping her, and that there was millions of dollars buried in the foundation and all kinds of things. All the cops did was give him a ride to the nearest bus station and tell my dad to file a restraining order, which we did. 6 months later, I'm 12, and my parents give me a house key and start letting me be more responsible and stay home by myself during the day. My dad got a day job, so from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., I was home alone. One day, I'm just getting off the bus, and I noticed this guy across the street, staring at me. I brushed it off. Figured he was just a parent waiting for the kids to get off the bus. This goes on for about a week. On the last day, I get home, lock the door behind me, and put my book bag down, get a snack, watch TV, and then there's a knock at the door. I look through the peephole. It's the guy from the bus stop. I don't say anything. I don't do anything. I just watch through the peephole, completely frozen. He knocks again, and again, and again. I know you're in there. Open the door, and this is my house. At that moment I knew who it was, and immediately called the police. As I'm on the phone with the cops, he starts losing it, hitting and kicking the door and the wall, and screaming at the top of his lungs that this was his house and to get out. When the cops pull up, he walks over to talk with them, I guess thinking they would be on his side. Instead, they arrest him for breaking the restraining order. After that, he finally left us alone. So my husband is a major skeptic, and that's why I was shocked at what he told me what he saw last night. Or actually very early morning, between 3 and 5 a.m. I kept trying to get him to admit he was joking, but he was dead serious, and assured me that he definitely saw something that he could not explain. He said he woke up and couldn't get back to sleep, so he went downstairs. This is not unusual for him. He often wakes up early and doesn't go back to sleep. We live in a row of townhouses. Our downstairs is at a second-level floor, with our living room/dining room/kitchen area, and a sliding glass door that opens up to a small enclosed desk and overlooks a strip of wooded area that makes up our backyard. He was sitting in a recliner that is positioned directly across the room from the sliding glass doors, and with nothing but the TV on. He could see the outside clearly enough, although there is a reflection in the glass door caused by the lights from the TV. I hope that my layout of the room makes sense to you all. After about half an hour to 45 minutes of watching TV, some movement outside catches his eye. He says he turned to look and plainly saw a woman floating several feet away from the desk, just hovering in his line of sight, right over our backyard, maybe 8 to 10 meters from where he sat. He says that she didn't seem to notice him. She slowly floated across our backyard towards the right, his right, until she disappeared from his view. He didn't get up to see where she'd gone. He just sat there and tried to process it. Since we live in a row of townhouses and the area is pretty well lit, I'm wondering how many backyards she traversed and if anyone else saw her. Unfortunately, it would be super weird to bring this up with any of our neighbors. We've only lived here for a few months and don't know anyone well enough to ask them about something so bizarre. I asked him for as many details as I could when he told me that this happened. He felt he could rule out sleep paralysis or any sleep-related hallucinations, as he had been wide awake for a while, and there had been no alcohol or drugs involved either. As for the floating lady, she was not close enough and it was too dark for him to make out any details. But she appeared to be a humanoid, female, with long white or light-colored hair and a slim build. The clothing appeared to be a light wispy material, possibly a gown, but again, the darkness and distance didn't allow him to see any details. She didn't glow or emit any light, and looked to be completely solid. So basically, my husband saw what appeared to be an otherwise normal-looking human woman, beside the obvious floating and flying thing, which he says made her seem ethereal. My husband says he's been lost in thought and walking around in a stupor today, because he absolutely doesn't believe in the paranormal, but he can't explain what he saw. When he first told me about this, he identified it as a ghost, but after mulling over the details, the closest thing we could think to is maybe some kind of fae. It's hard to know what to call a strange lady hovering in your backyard at 3 a.m. Any ideas are most certainly welcome. Also, just to add a little bit more, she's been seen 3 times since that last event. Every sighting occurred during the early hours, and he would be wide awake during this time. She won't always appear in the same spot, but usually it would be around our balcony. She also never looked directly at him. I personally have never seen her, but a couple of weeks ago I woke up and went downstairs with him, and he made me eggs and toast. I was sitting on the couch with him when he suddenly shouts, "Look, there she is!" But it was too dark for me to see anything without my glasses, and he said that she had vanished as soon as he had said something. Last night, something very different happened. I fell asleep on the couch, and my husband was awake watching TV. At around 1:45, he shook me awake, and he was clearly upset. He told me that she had showed up again. He said he felt strange, like he was being watched, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw her right next to him. This time she was standing on the seat of the couch, bent over with her face inches from his. She vanished as soon as he noticed her, but he was still very shaken by the experience. He asked me to come over to his side and snuggle him. I had to sit right where she was standing, and when I laid my head in his chest, his heart was pounding. I asked him if he wanted to go back to our room upstairs, but he said no, and when he calmed down a bit, he told me that he felt like he might have scared her just as badly as she scared him. He thinks maybe she was just being nosy, and went in for a closer look, not expecting to be seen, which makes me wonder if she's done it before, and checked us out while we were asleep. Even though she scared the crap out of him, he feels like she's harmless, but I don't know. This last incident seems aggressive to me. I think I would feel a lot better if I knew what the hell she was, and what it is that she wants. I don't expect to have the answer to these questions anytime soon, if ever. This happened many years ago. I was newly single and looking for a way to meet new people, so I thought I would try my luck at online dating. I created a profile and went about speaking to men online. I even met a few for coffee or lunch. My initial nervousness at the prospect of meeting strangers online for possible romance was calmed somewhat, as I learnt that there were a lot of nice guys out there just looking for companionship like I was, and I became optimistic. In the past, I had a habit of dating men that were non-commitment types. I realized I was ready to try and find someone that wanted something more serious. I made a mistake though, because in formulating this goal, I largely blamed myself for my failed past relationships, reasoning that perhaps I had somehow unconsciously chosen a partner who was not ready for commitment. I decided I should try to be more open to nice, sincere men who seemed ready for the kind of relationship that I was ready for. In doing so, however, I ended up ignoring the gut instincts that I had always followed, and this came back to bite me. Enter Mark. Mark worked in a bank and was divorced with one child. He was fairly good-looking, articulate, and we shared many interests. We began chatting online, and this progressed to phone calls after a few days. And finally, the idea arose to meet for coffee. Looking back now, I note he seemed in a hurry to meet me right from the get-go, despite me saying I preferred to speak for a while initially. We decided on a possible date, general location within my neighborhood, and general time, but it was not confirmed. I recall at the time I was pretty busy, and as we began to get closer to the date, I felt like I was going to be too busy to meet him. In the days leading up, without a location or exact time set, I didn't get back to him because I ended up getting tied up with other things and didn't know when I would be free. I hadn't spoken to him in several days by this point, and this is where the first red flag occurred. And in retrospect, I should have passed altogether with our meeting. But as I said, I was trying out this new attitude of being more open and accepting of nice men. On the date that we discussed meeting, I was out somewhere when my phone rang. I noticed that it was Mark. I picked up and he said in a warm tone, "Hello, I'm in your neighborhood. I know we said we were going to meet today, but where would you like to meet? Because I'm here now and waiting." I found this alarming, because not only had I never gotten back to him with a time or location, I knew for a fact he lived 2 cities away, and it would have taken a long time for him to drive down here on the loose plan of a meeting that was never confirmed. But again I told myself, hey, this guy really wants to meet you. He's sincere. Enjoy this for a change. So against my gut instinct, I told him I would meet him on a different day, and agreed on an actual date and time. The date went surprisingly well. He was just as good looking in real life. We had a good conversation and he was very nice, and we started seeing each other. He was all about romantic gestures, paying attention to me, calling me, and generally just being kind and sweet every day. He always seemed to want to spend time with me, and I told myself that this was what I had been missing for a long time. I did my best to try and appreciate the gestures and attention as something positive, even though I wasn't really used to it, and it did feel a little strange, because I didn't know him very well, and he would do things like show up unannounced with flowers to my work, only after a short amount of time seeing each other. He was also very touchy-feely, something I wasn't used to or fond of. I was uncomfortable with his constant kissing and touching, rubbing of my arm, and just generally suffocating me even when we were in public. I recall one time telling him that I was going to go downtown with a group of my girlfriends for a birthday celebration, and he insisted that we should go out for a drink alone beforehand. I said it wasn't really necessary, because I would have an hour or so to spend prior to going out with my friends. The drive for him was about an hour or more, and I felt like this is an extreme amount of trouble to go to see me for a short amount of time. But he insisted that even an hour with me would be worth it. When he arrived, I met him at a local pub. We had a drink, and then he laughed and joked that he should just come downtown with me and my girlfriends. I told him no, that was weird. He wasn't invited, and that wasn't what we discussed. He went home, dejected, and that was really the first time I felt a little bit annoyed with him. Things went on though, as I spent the night at his house after about 3 weeks. I told him that I had plans the next day, and that I would have to get going at around 10 a.m. However, when I went to leave the next morning, he got very distressed and kept insisting that I should stay because it was a beautiful day. And it was a real shame that I was leaving because there are so many wonderful things we should do together. That day, instead of me leaving to partake in the plans I had with my family. I should also mention that for the past week or so, he'd been insisting that he loved me and would tell me multiple times a day. I didn't reciprocate. When I finally went to get out of the front door, he basically wrapped around me in the doorway and kissed me all over, hugging me, and repeated that he loved me, that I was everything he wanted in his life as a woman. I got really grossed out in the way he was behaving and left, very irritated, and didn't say anything as I really did need to get going. I decided even before I was out his driveway that I was never going to see him again. Over the next day or two, I thought about how I would let him down and talked it over with my close friends. I kicked myself too for deliberately ignoring my gut. During this time, I responded to his relentless phone calls with polite texts to stall him until I was ready to speak with him. Finally, I settled on what I felt was a compassionate but firm approach to letting him down. I spoke to him on the phone and explained that I had come to the conclusion that I was not at a point in my life where I wanted a relationship whatsoever with anyone, including him. Lie. He kept trying to question what he had gotten wrong, what he misunderstood, but I kept repeating that he did nothing wrong. I simply didn't want to date. I went with this approach out of a complete lack of interest in doing anything to enlighten him on what a turn-off his behavior was. I had already enough responsibility in my life and had no desire to add a revoltingly pathetic man-child. Since we'd only been seeing each other for less than a month, I thought it would be the end of it. But I was wrong. I woke up the following day to find a long, desperate email in my inbox. He basically said he was mentally ill and that he was taking an antidepressant that he blamed for his clingy behavior, although I had not complained to him about his behavior at all. He ended by saying the word, "Throw out this medication, and therefore we should date again." The tone of the whole letter was panicked, selfish, and needy. He also repeated, "You are everything I want," but I did not once address the desires or feelings I had expressed for myself in our talk. I ignored it. Then the onslaught began. Over the week or so, he blew up my work phone, cell phone, and email with non-stop begging to reconsider his wants, of course, not mine. I became increasingly annoyed at how entitled he felt to dismiss everything I said that I wanted, and to blatantly intrude in my life with such a relentless stream of calls and emails. At work, for example, he called my desk phone literally 34 times in 3 hours. My coworkers were flabbergasted and even offered to answer and scream in his ear. I can't understand why he thought that behavior would somehow make someone like him. It obviously did the opposite. One of his texts to me was in regard to a pair of cheap, plastic, scratched sunglasses that he had left in my car. He claimed that they were very expensive, and that they belonged to his mother, and that she would be very upset if they weren't returned. Whatever, I thought. so I drove directly to his house and dumped them in his mailbox. I finally texted him back just after to let him know that they were in there and to not contact me again, so that hopefully he wouldn't formulate any more asinine excuses to see or talk to me. Of course, this didn't stop him. The onslaught continued several more days until he next claimed I'd left something small, a scarf or something, at his house, and that he needed to return it to me and would come to my work. I sent him another text. I told you to stop harassing me. If you contact me again, I'm calling the cops and will show them the onslaught of emails, voicemails, and texts you've been sending. This worked. Well, sort of. I continued to get the occasional Facebook messages from him for a few years, even though we weren't friends, and I never replied to a single one. In the last one, he told me that he had spotted me out in public somewhere. I was with my giant husband, thank God, and he wrote how good I looked, and added that he hoped still we could be friends again one day. No thanks, Mark. I don't want to be your friend, but thanks for the lesson learned. Never ignore your instincts. I was 10 years old and lived in Germany. I used to live in a big apartment complex that had a ground floor and a spiral staircase that led to a downstairs with 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, where my brother and my bedrooms were. One day I came home from school when I was in 5th grade, and as soon as I opened my front door and got into the hallway, every door that I could see was opening and closing by itself, and you could hear a high-pitched screaming coming from the downstairs basement area. I basically shat my pants and bolted out the door and waited for my brother to come back from school. He was 4 years older and in the 9th grade. When I saw him coming with his friends, I told them what I'd seen, and they went inside and saw the same thing I did. I saw them running outside, and they told me that they were not going back in, and they were going to the town center for a while instead. I was too young, so I waited outside until my dad came home from work, which was 2 hours. I got so impatient, I ran inside my house and sat in the living room corner with the TV on until Dad got home. The events had stopped when I ran in, so it was basically just me watching the hallway for an hour with cartoons in the background. When we told my dad, he didn't really think much of the story, and nothing really came from it. Later that year, when I was trying to sleep, I woke up to the sound of someone digging through my toy box as if they were looking for something. As my night vision was adjusting, all I could see was a light/blackish outline of a little boy slowly moving through my things. I was frozen in fear for about 10 minutes, until I finally just jumped out of bed, turned the light on, and jumped back into bed. I spent the rest of the night laying in bed staring at my toy box until everyone was waking up for school and work. After this happened, I refused to sleep downstairs, and my dad moved me to one of the upstairs bedrooms. After living in that house for 5 years, everyone in my family living there, dad and brother, have seen some scary-ass stuff happen. My dad recalls seeing a dark man walking down the hallway when my brother and I were visiting our mum over the summer, and also recalls doors being opened downstairs that he was sure he closed. Friends that have stayed the night, and people who have stayed for a number of days here, have also seen the dark man in my old house. I think that my old place might just be haunted. As she said it, he tutored her for about an hour, and then made them both dinner. It was 7 p.m. by now, and Pam wanted to leave, but he told her to eat and that he would drive her home afterwards. It was pitch dark, and the storm was picking up considerably. "A girl like you shouldn't be walking home at night," he told her. Pam was nervous, but she knew he was right, and she wasn't confident she'd even be able to find her way home in all this snow, so she stayed. When they finished eating, Pamela went for the door, but he stopped her and asked if she would do him a favor. He went into his bedroom and beckoned for her to follow. Hesitant as she was, she peeked into the room and saw a full photo studio set up against the wall facing the bed. He told her to stand in front of the lights so that he could take a few photos and then he'd take her home. Frightened and confused in a country she was unfamiliar with a man she thought she could trust, she did as she was told, and after a few minutes, the requests got darker. He showed her pictures of other girls, mostly college-age Latinas, who he had taken pictures of in various positions and state of undress, and asked her if she would do some of those poses. She said no, she didn't want to undress. So he pulled a pair of boxer shorts and a tank top out of his top drawer and tossed them at her. "Put these on then. Just a few pictures and then we'll go. I promise." She went into the bathroom to change into the clothes he'd given her, and just sat there, cursing at her dead phone on the brink of tears. For 5, 10, and 15 minutes, she couldn't even remember how long she sat there, until he started knocking at the door. "Pamela, come on. I was just kidding. Come out of there. I'll take you home now." Not completely trusting him, but knowing there was no other way to get out of this situation, she exited the bathroom. He apologized for making her feel uncomfortable and offered to drive her home, at which point she grabbed her things, said she was fine walking, and left. He didn't go after her, and he didn't try to stop her. She did, in fact, end up getting lost and walking around town for over an hour. She did, in fact, end up getting lost and walked around town for over an hour before the boys found her a few blocks from the complex. We urged her to tell this story to the police, but they said technically no crime was committed, so she told the head of the program. He accepted it a little too easily, as if he expected it, and we later found out this was not the first time something like this had happened. We already knew it wasn't, because he had pictures of other girls, but an especially ugly story found its way to us. Apparently, the previous year, a South American girl was really struggling in class and received tutoring from Charles. After 2 or 3 sessions, she stopped going despite her grades not improving. She became exceedingly closed off and stopped going out altogether, often missing classes. After a few weeks, she dropped out of the program and flew back home. No one knew her well enough to ask why, but they all had a sneaking suspicion it was because of Charles. After hearing Pamela's experience, the program immediately dropped Charles as a teacher, which just proves that this was not the first complaint against him. This last bit might just be a rumor, but I heard from a pretty solid source that after Pamela filed the complaint, the police checked him out, and Charles wasn't even his real name. Turns out he'd been using fake information to get teaching gigs around the country for the past 5 to 10 years, and was actually a registered sex offender. He's probably in jail right now, but in any case, Charles, or whatever your name is, who likes to use your authority to prey on vulnerable Latina girls who are alone in new countries, let's not meet. Last summer, two friends of mine and myself decided to go on a road trip through the American Southwest. We'd been traveling for 2 days and were driving to southwestern Utah, heading from Zion National Park to St. George, where my friend Spencer's grandparents lived, and offered for us to stay for the night. It had been a long day, with about 8 hours of driving, and me having done about 6 of them, as well as a lot of hiking. So we were understandably exhausted and anxious to get into a nice bed, especially after the shitty hotel mattresses of the previous 2 days. We were also running really late. We had planned to arrive at around 8, but it ended up being around 10:30 when we got to St. George. Anyway, we finally get off the highway in St. George, when Spencer decides to tell my other friend Ian and I how his grandparents' house is right across the street from a graveyard. Okay, well, that's spooky, especially when coming by after dark. But it's not like we have another free place to stay. So what you gonna do? Spencer starts giving us some background on his grandparents, and we turn into the neighborhood. So while following the direction of the GPS, I see a stop sign around 50 yards away. Next to the sign, I see 3 small human-like figures. At first, I'm like, what are those kids doing? They're like 7 years old. Why are they out at 10:30 p.m. on a Tuesday without their parents? Don't they have school tomorrow? We get closer, my 2 friends still not talking and not paying attention. And upon closer examination, the figures were not kids, but poles to road signs. I relax, then I start slowing down for the stop sign, and look back at the poles, and realize it was little kids after all. But something was off. These kids were perfectly still, not looking at each other or talking for the entire 15 seconds or so they'd been in my view, which, given, isn't entirely weird. But as we approached the stop sign, they stared into our car with the most demonic little faces I'd ever seen. None smiled. They all just looked super disappointed. I don't really know how to describe it, but the kids, who were definitely present and real, seemed somehow translucent, like they were ghosts. My friends stopped talking and noticed, which was weird. It's not like these children were particularly unique, other than their odd presence at night, and I hadn't said or done anything to warrant a reaction. So they apparently were also getting the sense that something was up. The time it took to round the corner staring at these ghost children in the eyes seemed like an eternity. As I turned right, their gaze followed us the whole way, looking through us. I shouted, "What the hell was that?" And my friends were equally as spooked and in hysterics. A couple of seconds later, I looked into the rearview window, where they should have been, and they were gone. We make another right turn at the next opportunity, and there's the Mormon church and graveyard, just a block away with Spencer's grandparents' house, halfway between the spooky children corner and the graveyard. Once I parked the car, all of us looked over at each other, daring the other to go out first. Finally, Ian steps out, and we head inside sprint walking, not even bothering to take the time to get our bags out of the trunk. Spencer's grandma answers the door and lets us in, and we pretend like nothing had ever happened. I think what happened is partially my fault for lying, but what happened creeped me the hell out. This happened when I was 14. I was in my emo phase, and since nobody understood me, I went online to find people to talk to. And that's where I met my boyfriend. I had been with my boyfriend for about 3 months when this happened, and we were finally going to meet each other. He lived on the other side of the country, so going with a plane would clearly be the quickest. But since we were both young and had no money, he found a cheap bus to go with. It was about Christmas time, and the roads were covered in snow, so of course the bus was late. My boyfriend sent me a text letting me know he would be late, that the bus would arrive in a bigger city 30 minutes away from the one I live in, and I had already taken the bus to pick him up, so there was no point going home. I then texted him, "Oh damn, when are you gonna be here then?" "I don't know, the bus driver said he couldn't tell us yet." I told you he scammed you." "Oh, he says he'll be about 40 minutes late. Sorry, babe." "It's okay. What do you want to do when you get here?" "I want to get something to eat. I should have brought something to the bus." "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm actually really hungry right now. Would it be okay if I go get something?" "Yeah, of course, baby. What are you getting?" "I'm thinking about some Mackie D." "Fancy. You know I have no money." Then I put my phone in my pocket and walked into McDonald's. There were a lot of people in there, and I considered leaving. But I had no money to get anything better than junk food, so I bit the sour apple and stood in line. Then someone walked in and stood behind me. It wasn't anything odd, since the McDonald's I was at was often busy. But suddenly I felt something on my butt, but it quickly disappeared again. I thought it must have been a mistake, and I'm not a sensitive person, so I didn't confront them about it. But then it happened again. This time they poked me more aggressively. "Yo, what the hell?" I thought to myself. Then it happened again, and I turned around to see a guy putting his phone up to my butt. Note that I'm a very socially awkward person, and I had no idea what to say, since I had never been in a situation like this. I ended up just smiling an awkward smile, and looked at him. He was a 175 centimeter tall skinny guy, who looked like a mess. He then smiled at me, and took a step back. Must have been an accident, I thought. But then I felt his phone on my butt again. I then turned around and quietly said, "Excuse me." He just smiled like nothing had happened, and said, "Hi there," in a really happy tone. I didn't even find his smile creepy, and I think that's actually what made this so scary. He sounded like a totally normal person. He kept that tone, even though what he did was super creepy. "Where are you from?" he then asked. I told him I was just from the city which we were currently in. He just looked at me with that totally normal wide smile and asked again, "Where are you from?" like he didn't understand what I said. Note that I'm not in an English-speaking country, and the conversation had been in Danish the whole time, up until what I did next. I decided I'd pretend to be someone just in case he was some weird creep, because I was honestly getting freaked out. I then began speaking to him in English, like I was not from here. "Yes, I'm from California visiting a friend." "Oh, I see," he replied, still smiling. "I am not good at English. I hope understand you." I got relieved, as I realized he wasn't good at English, and I hoped he would stop and leave the conversation at that. I turned around again, and there were still at least 5 to 6 groups in front of me who had to order. So there was still a lot of time between my turn to order and now. Then I felt someone tap on my shoulder again. I turned around to look at him, and I gave him the look that said, "Please leave me alone, you creep." And he finally seemed to get it, because his wide, creepy smile began fading away. His eyes looked wild, but he still looked calm. It was a look that's hard to describe. "How old are you?" he asked. I now said something stupid that I regret saying. I should have told him I was only 14 at the time. But then he probably wouldn't have bought my story that I was in Denmark all alone. "I'm 17, I said. "Old enough to travel by yourself, but still not legal." When a creepy smile began to appear on his face, that's when I knew I'd messed up. "That's nice. And where is your friend? Where does she live? How old is she? Is she as pretty as you?" He said it and walked up to my side instead of standing behind me. He was way too close. There probably wasn't even 50 centimeters between us. I was completely speechless, because I'd never experienced something like this. This might not sound that crazy, but as a 14-year-old I was freaking out. I'm 26 myself, but that isn't a problem, is it? I just looked straight ahead, trying not to make eye contact. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he said in a cold tone. I looked at him with my emo bangs covering my face. He then began to touch my face and hair with his filthy hands. "Get that hair away from your face and look at me, baby." I looked at him, and he smiled again. That smile was making me absolutely sick, and I wanted to puke everywhere. "There we go. You know I really love emo chicks," and pulled my hair away from my neck and began kissing and licking my neck. I was furious, but I was completely frozen in shock. He could see that I was getting scared. Hell, everyone could. Everyone saw that he was doing this to me, and they heard what he was saying. Yet nobody did a thing. This is an aspect of humanity which I oh so much despise. People can be so disgusting, only thinking of themselves, and not paying attention or stepping up when someone needs assistance. He came even closer and began wrapping his arms around me and said, "Come with me. We'll go get your friend." And he took my hand. I slapped his hand away and yelled at him, "I'm not a hooker." And I then ran to a place where I could be alone and called my mum crying. And when my boyfriend met up with me, he comforted me. Again, it's not a big story about how he went on and killed everyone there. I just found this extremely disturbing as a 14-year-old. I don't want to end my story with saying that what he did traumatized me so much that I never dare go into McDonald's again, because I actually plan on going there with someone later. And I don't want to end this story by saying I'll never forget the creepy smile on his face either, because that wouldn't be true. I have a medical diagnosis that means I cannot remember faces, and I'll never know if I see him again. But no matter if I remember you or not, please, let's never meet again. When I was about 8, my family moved into a new house. There were 2 bedrooms on the 2nd level, and 1 downstairs, and my new bedroom was the master bedroom upstairs. I loved the room for its size, but also found it creepy. What was most creepy for me was the storage units built into the wall. They made me feel very uneasy. This unease/terrified feeling was there every night when lights would go out. At the time, I thought I was just a kid who was scared at night because the room was big and new. That soon changed when I started waking up every night, early in the morning, feeling like someone else was in the room with me. I would run and turn on my light, see nothing, but fall back asleep with the light on, waking up with it that way in the morning. This continued every night for quite some time. My bed was against a wall, and one night when I had just gotten into bed after turning off the lights, I started falling asleep close to the edge of the bed. As I went to roll over and face the wall, half asleep, there was a face of a smiling old woman that quickly vanished. I jumped out of the bed, turned on the light finding nothing, and I woke my parents and they said it was a dream. From that night on, I slept with my back pressed to the wall to prevent the same thing from happening again. That was my first sighting. Shortly after that, we got a cat. The first night we had her, she came into my room early in the morning, after I was already sitting up with the light on. First thing she did was go over to the storage unit. Actually, she crept over to it, sniffing the whole way there, her eyes wide and tail up and fluffy. When she got to the door, still sniffing, I heard a voice whisper, "Hi," and she bolted from the room. I knew I wasn't imagining it, because she clearly heard it too, and I slept on the couch that night. The nights following, I didn't want to sleep in my room, but after my parents had caught me on the couch after the cat incident, they told me I had to sleep there, and it was my imagination at night. The next encounter started off like the others. I awoke early in the morning, as I usually did, except I was very cold and I felt like someone was watching me. So I rubbed my eyes and sat up. Standing in the middle of my room by the storage door was a man who seemed to be transparent and lit up glowing an almost bluish color. He was heavy-set, with black, thick-rimmed glasses, in camo pants, a hat, and a camo jacket, with a white t-shirt. He was holding his hand over his stomach. He looked at me, then he looked down at his stomach, and moved his hand/jacket to reveal a wound and blood. He looked back up, making eye contact, with a, again, confused expression on his face, and I ran out of the room with my blankets. I slept on the couch that night, not caring if I got into trouble in the morning. I told my parents the next day, but they told me it wasn't real, and I was probably dreaming, and I had to sleep in my room. Following that night, I slept in my room every night. No encounters were quite as vivid as that one, but they didn't stop. One early morning, I woke up and had a quick glimpse of an old woman in a purple ball gown dress, rushing out of my closet and disappearing a few steps later into the storage unit. Another morning I woke up, and there was a young boy in overalls just standing by the unit innocently. I looked at him, went under the covers, and went back to sleep. I didn't feel like he was going to hurt me, or even knew that I was there, but I had no choice but to stay in that room. I never quite got used to the feeling, and encountered only glimpses after the camo guy, but I learnt to live with it. We moved from the house when I was 12, and I never experienced anything like it again. even though, according to my parents, it was just my crazy imagination. My parents joke with me about it now, thinking that I was just making the whole thing up. I am still a skeptic in regard to the supernatural and ghosts, but I have no explanation for what I now know I saw as a kid. This happened quite a few years ago, when I was a relatively young and sheltered high school student, probably 15 years old. Some of my close girlfriends and I decided to go to the drive-in movie theater one night, where they showed 2 movies in a row, and the whole shebang ends pretty late at night, probably around 1 a.m. or so. The 5 of us all drive in my friend Erin's car, as we're pulling the seats down and setting the back of the car up with blankets and pillows. Erin recognizes a guy, David, who she'd met a few times because he worked at her gym. He was at the drive-in alone, not necessarily weird, just not something that many people did in my town, and came over to our car to chit-chat. Immediately, one of my other friends, Kareen, took a liking to this guy and began flirting up a storm. It wasn't soon until Kareen invited him to watch the movie with us, inside of Erin's car. It also wasn't soon until this David guy offered us, 15 to 17-year-old girls, alcohol, which we accepted. Looking back now, what a red flag. I was wary of this David character, as he appeared significantly older than us, at least mid-20s, and gave me somewhat of a weird vibe. But since Erin seemed to know him, and my friends weren't acting alarmed, I didn't give it too much thought. We're not even 15 minutes into the movie, and I'm just too uncomfortable to be enjoying myself. 6 people crammed into the back of one car, and Kareen and David cuddling and flirting and who knows what underneath the blankets, made me want to get out of there ASAP. So when David suggested that me and my 3 remaining friends could watch the movie in his car, while he stayed in Erin's car and canoodled, I jumped to take him up on the offer. David's car was a small sedan with little room, so we had to sit in the seats normally, as if we were about to ride in the car. Although I was a little uncomfortable sitting in the driver's seat with the steering wheel between me and the screen, I was glad to finally have some personal space. That all changed when I dropped my phone, and it landed somewhere underneath the driver's seat. While blindly reaching underneath to find my phone, I grabbed onto a hard object that I realized was a lot heavier than my iPhone when I began to lift it up. To my complete and utter surprise, I realized it was a gun. I had never seen a real-life gun before at that point in my life, so it could have easily been a fake or BB. But it looked real, felt real, and was hidden underneath the driver's seat for easy access. It freaked me out, because even if it were a fake gun, what could he be intending to use it for besides intimidation? For whatever reason, my friends didn't find this as startling as I did, and they managed to calm me down and concluded that the best thing to do would just be to put it underneath the seat where I found it. That was fine to me, as they didn't plan on ever being back in his car again once the film was over, and definitely didn't plan on being in the car when David was in it. The rest of the 2 movies went by fine. We're drinking the beer that this David character so kindly provided to us, and having a fun time. It's late by the time this second movie ends, so I'm ready to get back to our friend Erica's house where we were sleeping for the evening. I hop out of David's car ready to get back into Erin's car, when I see Erin's car is already driving away. Kareen pops up and cheerfully announces that David has offered to drive us home. How nice of him. Having no other way to get home, and being slightly intoxicated, and watching the rest of my friends pile into the car, I follow suit. Even though I had my hesitations, David sat in the driver's seat. I sat behind him, and Corinne sat shotgun, and began playing her signature Justin Bieber playlist through the speakers. The car ride started out normal enough, with Erica giving directions to her house, and Corinne not paying attention to anything but her Bieber, and me feeling uneasy and hyper aware of the situation. As we are approaching Erica's house, David asks us if we have time for a quick drive up to the reservoir, which was located on the outskirts of town, very isolated and surrounded by a heavily wooded area. It's probably close to 2 a.m. at this point, and the only person who even slightly knew this random man has left us, and I know there is a very real gun underneath the seat of this guy's car that he doesn't know I know about. So of course I say, no. David just says, we're going up to the reservoir. Confused and alarmed, I start politely protesting, saying we really don't have time, and that we're being expected at home. Yada yada. But with every word I say, David turns up the volume of the music up louder and louder, drowning out my voice and obviously ignoring me, as he starts to head up the long dark road that leads to the reservoir. I go into panic mode, annoyed that none of my friends are doing anything, especially Corinne, who is still singing along to Bieber. I start to freak out, and I decide that he can't take us up to the reservoir. He just can't. What if the gun is real and he threatens us with it, or worse? What if the gun isn't real, but he still uses it to threaten us, or something? A million thoughts race to my head. I won't let him take us into a secluded area, where any number of things could happen, and no one could hear us. I decide if he's going to do something to us, I would rather risk it being there, in town, on a more populated road where our chances of survival or whatever were better. So I literally freak out. All sense of politeness I felt I needed to have are gone. I started kicking the back of his chair with both my feet, screaming at the top of my lungs that he needs to take us back now. I roll down the window and start shouting, trying to cause a scene, doing anything I can to stop this man from driving us to the middle of nowhere. I don't stop kicking and screaming until he relents, almost scoffs and says, "Fine," as if I was some crazy lady, completely overreacting to the situation. But you know what? I don't care what he thinks. I'm just relieved he has turned the car around and is actually taking us back to Erica's house. Once we get there and run out of the car, we wake up Erica's parents to let them know what happened, since this guy now has one of our addresses. I didn't sleep that whole night, and my friendship with Corinne was irreparably damaged from her putting me in such a terrifying situation, just because she had the hots for this guy. Creepy drive-in movie theater guy with a hidden gun, who doesn't listen to scared 15-year-old girls. Let's not meet. This was in the 90s when I was 15. My mum, my best friend and I were in Florida on vacation for 3 weeks. We discovered Sizzlers and really loved it, so we ended up going for dinner there quite often, and also got to know the waiters a bit. One night, we noticed a middle-aged man sitting at a nearby table, who was staring, and I mean really staring at me. He was with a young boy, maybe 5 to 6 years old. They had already finished their dinner, but the guy was just transfixed, completely ignoring this kid. He wasn't smiling or frowning, just a blank-faced stare. My mum was getting really uncomfortable, so she spoke to one of the male waiters who'd we'd become friendly with. I don't know what exactly she said to him, but I think it was basically to help keep an eye out. It might be worth mentioning that my mother is usually quite comfortable with confronting strangers if required, but something made her choose not to in this case. The guy and the little kid eventually left, though it took what seemed like an eternity. Once they'd gone, We were just relieved and carried on with our dinner. I think that we were there for at least another hour before we were ready to go. When we were getting into our car, I noticed another car parked a bit behind us with someone inside. It was the guy from the restaurant, without a kid in sight. Even worse, when we started driving, he started his car without his headlights on and began tailing us. We basically freaked out. My mom started driving in a different direction of the hotel as to not to lead him where we were staying. We drove around for a while before we eventually lost him and finally made it back to the hotel. My mom went straight to the front desk to inform them about what was going on and to keep an eye out. I'm not sure if she did end up contacting the police, but we were all glad to be safe. Thankfully, nothing else happened after that, other than a terrible night's sleep. But it was scary as hell at the time, especially because he seemed to have lost his kid and just waited for us. When I was younger, I had a bad nightmare that eventually roused me awake. My routine as a child, if I had a nightmare, was to call my parents from their room. Their room is just down the hall, so they would hear me, pick me up, and bring me into their room. This particular night, my dad was still at work. He has always worked fairly late, so my mum was the one who came into my room to pacify me. Keep in mind for later, my father was not home at the time. He did not come home until much later. She brings me into their room, and I was lying down on my dad's side since he wasn't home. My dad's side faces the door that leads into the long hallway. The door was open, so if I peeked over I could see the hallway from where I was laying. At one point, I had an eerie feeling. I just felt like something was there, and I had this strong impulse to look. I looked into the hallway, and sure enough there was a bright glowing white silhouette of a man. I couldn't discern too much of his features, but I could make out a friendly smile. He had glasses and was walking towards me. I recalled later that he looked like a younger version of my father that I'd seen in family photos. The figure seemed nice, but I was already terrified as it was. I quickly looked away. I let a few moments pass and garnered up the courage to look back out into the hallway. The figure was gone. I didn't tell anyone for years after that, until I was much older, when I finally told my dad about what I saw. He told me that he was supposed to have another brother, but that he died in the womb. I like to think that the figure I saw was him. From what I could make out, he did look a lot like my father. So, this is an ongoing situation, but it just went from annoying to seriously creepy. There's a maintenance guy at the office building I work at. He is hired through the landlord of the building, not our company. We'll call him Bob. Bob is an older guy, maybe late 50s, and a former heroin addict. I say former because we are all pretty sure Bob still occasionally indulges in the habit. He is very socially awkward, and his mannerisms and ways of speaking are strange. He talks really slowly and pauses in places where pauses don't make any sense, or trails off mid-sentence. He also gets super close when he talks to you and makes intense eye contact, or stares at me through our huge front window that happens to be in front of my desk. So overall, mildly creepy guy. He has done some weird things in the past, like given me his personal number, brought a co-worker a $200 wedding gift and had it delivered to her, as I work with all women. They're staring at people through the window, and he gave me a toy riding horse thing for my son. The kind that's on springs that rocks back and forth, and asks me personal questions about my marriage, and tried to ask me if I'd go on a date with him. I also found my car door open, and a bunch of my stuff, like paperwork and some perfume, and makeup I keep in my center console, moved around once when he was here. Today, he comes into the front office and just kind of stands there after saying hi. I ask my co-worker if I can go out and have a smoke, and she says yes. I go get into my car and kept the door cracked so I could smoke. I was parked under a covered carport thing outside the back door, across from the utility/supply room. All of a sudden, Bob is standing there and kind of grabs the door and opens it a bit. I don't know where he came from, but I was listening to music, so wasn't really paying attention. I took my headphones out and looked at him like, what? He doesn't answer right away, then asks me if I can take him to the store. A, he has a big white truck that he knows I know he has. And B, he knows damn well I can't just leave while I'm working. I tell him that, and he goes, No, it's okay. I already asked the co-worker and she was fine with it. I ask him why he can't just drive himself, and he sits there for a second, looking at me, and then asks me to help him with something in the utility room. I say no, and that I need to get back to work before I'm yelled at. He stared for a minute, and then smiles the creepiest smile and says, No, you won't. They think you've taken me to the store. We have plenty of time. I don't know if I'm accurately conveying the creepy, scary vibe he was putting off, but I was scared at this point. I didn't know what he wanted, or what he was trying to accomplish, but it wasn't anything good. And on top of that, he wasn't moving out of my way, and was about 6 inches away from me. I tell him to move, and he stands there for a few seconds and finally does. I dialed 911 on my cell, and jumped out of the car and ran inside. I seriously thought he was going to grab me and push me into the utility room or something. I'm still in shock about it. Oh, and he didn't ask my co-workers anything about the store. Of course, he made that up. He left right after that whole thing, and I don't really know what to do about this situation. This was 2015. I wasn't really actively looking, but would pop onto OkCupid every few weeks to see if anything interesting was in my inbox. Being female, I had a very active inbox. Sorry guys. I noticed an email from an interesting, fairly local guy. The email was alright, asking about polyamory, which I don't mind talking about if the person asking is sincerely interested and respectful. We get to chatting, and I had zero romantic interest, but thought this could be a friendship. And after a few months of talking, he found me on the Book of Faces, and asked if it was okay to send a request. I agreed. We'd been chatting and getting along well, and he seemed like a nice person. Little weird, but I'm a little weird myself. We continued to chat here and there for about 2 years, sent birthday greetings and just a casual friendship. He asked several times to meet and hang out, and I considered it, but at that time I was running my own business and worked about 70 hours a week, plus maintaining my home and raising a young child. And trying to balance 2 partners and an extremely needy, demanding workaholic client who had no boundaries with 11 PM phone calls without a note of hesitation or remorse, it never occurred for me to meet up, but we kept in touch online. Late last year, a news story broke out about a man and his girlfriend murdering her young teen daughter. I never connected the name until a few friends contacted me and said, "Oh, I see you're friends with him. Did you see the news?" The news stories all use his legal full name, which is why I never connected the two dots. My then online friend of 2 years had beaten, sexually assaulted and strangled and then dismembered his girlfriend's teenage daughter, with the girlfriend's help. He made several statements since then, stating that he always had this fantasy, and that this child was very sexual, and that it wasn't fun murdering her, but he apparently thought it would be. Still sends a chill down my spine. I dodged a bullet big time. Be safe out there. You never know who's on the other side of a keyboard or phone call. I am still very much a skeptic about ghosts and ghouls, but my brother's house has a lot of creepy stuff happening on a regular basis. Some examples. Doors that have a metal L latch would just pop open as if someone had flicked them, usually when people were in the room changing. The refrigerator door would fling open by itself. We would constantly hear the sound of footsteps from the bedroom upstairs when nobody's there. And my old dog, who died when I was younger, had a very specific sneeze where she'd sneeze maybe 3 or 4 times in a row, and her collar would hit the floor and rattle. If the house is quiet, sometimes you can hear her walking in the kitchen or her sneeze. One time, my brother and his wife were setting up all the evidence of Santa and Rudolph on Christmas Eve night after the kids had went to bed. They both cut some celery and carrots and drank some milk. As they both left the kitchen and headed towards the living room, they heard a boom and turned around back into the kitchen. Where they just were was the plate and the stalk of celery, sticking straight up on its end, and the knife was jabbed into the stalk. Also, literally every kid who sleeps over has claimed they couldn't sleep because the man with the hat on is watching them on the stairs. More than one person has seen a figure like this walking down the stairs from the corner of their eyes. And my wife, who didn't know anything was weird about the house yet, went to feed the dog. This was while my brother was on vacation and I was at work. She ran out of there because she heard whispers coming from the hallway and swears she saw something moving in the shadows. My only experience that I personally witnessed, which I still think was because I was overly tired or something, was when I spent the night and was on my side facing the wall sleeping, and something whistled in my ear. It was loud enough for me to jump up and looked around. I didn't feel any breath on me, just the whistle. So I turned the other way and tried to fall back asleep, and then it happened in that ear too. I can't think of any more creepy stuff, but my dad, who is very religious, claims the house has evil spirits in it. My friend, who was a ghost hunter, said he would investigate the house if they wanted to, but my brother and his wife are too afraid of stirring things up, so they said no. I lived there for about 6 months and visit all the time and have never seen or heard anything. But who knows? I do live in upstate New York, where we have a lot of historic buildings and haunted history. But again, I've never seen anything spoopy enough to rustle my jimmies and claim that ghosts are afoot. This past October, I got the lucky chance to finally work at a haunted house. It's been my dream job since a really young age, and a friend of mine hooked me up with the gig. Maddie had worked at this haunted house the previous year, and told me how fun and thrilling it was. I agreed to work with her, and the job was overall amazing. I played Regan from The Exorcist, and my fellow co-workers said I was one of the best acts in the attraction. My bosses were also pretty proud, and even posted a video of me on their Facebook. The job was just pure delight, except for one of the workers. Besides getting home at around 1 in the morning and losing my voice due to constantly screaming, this creepy co-worker almost soured the whole experience for me. Daniel was in his mid-40s. He worked in the haunted house as a butcher. He was a tall and brawny guy, definitely far more intimidating than my other co-workers, who were teenagers. I was 17. So was Maddie. He's bald and had a few tattoos on his arms. Any attempts at conversation were always awkward. I'm not saying that in a judging manner. It was just visible that something was a bit off about this guy. Daniel first started to talk to me after my first shift. He was complimenting my performance and how loud I could scream, which I didn't find odd at all. All the other workers were complimenting me as well, so him mentioning it wasn't out of the ordinary. I thanked him, we exchanged names, shook hands, and that was the end of my shift. Every shift that followed the first, Daniel would always compliment me, shake my hand, and asked me for my name again, even though I'd already told him a handful of times. Then his creepiness only increased. One night, while all the workers are lining up to clock out and leave, Daniel goes on a huge rant to Maddie and me about his personal life. He mentions how much he hates his ex-wife and would love to beat her up because how she abused him. Daniel also said he is divorcing his current wife, whom he says that he still loves. I was just baffled that he, out of the blue, decided to rant about personal issues to 2 teenagers. But I brushed it off, clocked out, and Maddie and I drove home. On the ride home, I told Maddie how odd Daniel is, and she agreed, but argued that he's nice. So keep in mind that Maddie knew I was not particularly fond of Daniel and wanted nothing to do with him. A few shifts later, the worst incident involving Daniel occurred. The haunted house was closed, and all the workers were scrubbing off their grotesque makeup and changing back into their regular clothes. I was out of the break room washing off my makeup with about 6 other people in the room with me, including Maddie and Daniel. Out of nowhere, Daniel just blurts out, "Man, my ride just cancelled on me." I could obviously tell that this was one of those statements where he is fishing for attention. I kept my trap shut and continued washing off my nasty makeup. Maddie, being an overly generous and sometimes airheaded teen, quickly offered to give him a ride. The very moment those words fell from her mouth, my heart sunk to the pit of my stomach. Maddie was also taking me home that night, since we alternated who drove to work. My eyes quickly shifted to Maddie, who somehow didn't see the strangeness in 2 teenagers giving a 45-year-old man a ride home at midnight. Daniel said very happily, "Thank you so much," and detailed where he lived. Knowing I couldn't just blurt out, "No," in front of Daniel, I gave Maddie a stern look and left the room. Bewildered, I walked out of the room to change out of my sweat-drained dress and into my normal clothes with the notion that I am about to endure an awkward and creepy car ride with Daniel. I was livid at Maddie. She knew that Daniel frightened me, and never thought to think before she blurted out her offer. I stayed back in the dressing room, too scared to hop in the car with Daniel, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. So I built up some courage and returned to the break room where Maddie was. Daniel was no longer there, but Maddie was there as well as a few other workers. She informed me that another worker, a very sweet woman who's about Daniel's age, was going to take him home instead of us, and a huge wave of relief washed over me. On our way home, I asked Maddie why the plans changed. What she said further corrected my suspicion. While I was changing out of my exorcist costume, our boss Joey pulled Maddie into his office to say that she couldn't take Daniel home. He elaborates how Daniel is bipolar and can get angry very easily and is violent, and it's not safe for two teenage girls to be alone with him in the middle of the night. That's when the older woman offered to take Daniel home. This incident infuriates me in two ways. One, why would a grown man think it's okay for two teenage girls to take him home? And two, how could Maddie be so blind and lack vital common sense to know this was not a good idea? Thankfully that moment passed, but there's still one more incident that remains. Ever since the last scenario, Daniel stopped talking to me. If I had to guess, Joey probably told him to stop. About the second to last night at working in the haunted house, Daniel got hurt. While everyone is getting ready and putting makeup on, Daniel enters the break room with a gnarly gash on the top of his head and is spurting out pools of blood. We all thought it was really good makeup at the time, but Daniel claims he was messing with the garage door inside the attraction and it fell on his head. For such a deep cut that was bleeding profusely, Daniel seemed way too nonchalant and insisted that he didn't need medical attention. He just sat in the break room for a while, with the wound just pouring blood while we all applied our makeup. A part of me feels like wounding himself was intentional, but I could be wrong. He just seems way too chill about it all. And that's that. It was really enough to shake me at the time every time I saw him. Thankfully, the room I was positioned in was nowhere near his, so he was never in my room alone. There is one further update I would also like to include. Just a few days ago, I was informed of something that really made my heart stop. Apparently, about a month ago, after the haunted house had closed, Daniel killed himself. I wasn't told how, not that that's any of my business, but the news came out of nowhere. I pray his family is doing alright, and that Daniel is no longer suffering. I used to daydream about driving across the country in an RV and seeing the world. I had wanderlust like no other, and the van dwellers of Instagram really made it look so easy and fun. I was hooked, and after I made up my mind, I bought a van and souped it up with a bed, drawers, storage, bike rack, and even a little bathroom area. The tiny home on wheels held so much potential, and the future looked bright, or so I thought. I made my way to the first destination on my list, Charleston, USA. It was beautiful, and I had dreams of spending my days on the beach watching the sunrise and set each morning. Well, as some of you may or may not know, this was a van, and some stealth camping needed to be done to ensure safety, and that I wouldn't get towed or bothered by law enforcement. Volume levels were low, and lights were always dimmed when I spent time in my van. Not only that, but the windows were tinted, and I had curtains as well, so you couldn't really see anything through them. On the first night, I decided to park in a back alley parking lot with no streetlights and no pedestrian traffic. I felt safe and comfortable enough to relax and play some Pokemon on my DS. I was propped up on a pillow that was laying against the back double doors. After 30 minutes after I parked, I noticed a man walk past my van. He seemed to be in a hurry, so I didn't pay him any mind. About 15 minutes pass, and I hear a jingle sound, and then a scraping noise. I turn around and there he is, the same man trying to break into my van as I sit in it. Our faces only inches apart through the glass. He doesn't see me. In this moment, I kind of reacted as you would if a dog does something that makes you want to get its attention and make it stop. I have dogs, so this was automatic. And I made a sound sort of like a ahem. Well, that got his attention. He looks up and squints at me, and I say, "Get out." He goes, "Oh, shit," and runs out. Looking back, it was kind of funny, as I knew he didn't mean me any harm, but probably shit his pants when he found out I had caught him. It really was the next night, though, that made me realize van living isn't all it's cracked up to be. I decided to park in a more crowded area the next night. Before hunkering down, I drove to a nearby grocery store to grab food. Little naive me thought that since this is a grocery store, I should be able to have my lights on bright and not be bothered. I turned the lights up and did some cleaning before bed, i.e. folding clothes, fluffing pillows and sweeping. I notice a car across the parking lot that's cranked up with its lights on as well, but hasn't actually pulled out yet. I don't pay much mind as I finish up my cleaning. The next thing I know, the same car has driven behind my van and is just sitting in the lane, not moving. I wait for a while and it doesn't budge, so I decide to cut off my lights and sit in the driver's seat to observe. It still doesn't move. My internal alarm system is going berserk, so I decide to get the hell out of there and crank up my van so I can leave. I need to pull out, but the car is blocking me. I start inching out in reverse, and the driver finally gets the message and drives away. I watch the car leave and stop at an intersection. There are only two ways it can go. It can either go left, which exits the parking lot, and means that the person isn't a threat, or could go right, which circles back into the parking lot, and means that this person is possibly a threat. I wait and watch, and for some reason I don't see which direction the car turns, and I chalk it up to being confused and paranoid. After a few minutes, I decide to leave. Remember when I said there were only two ways the car could go? Well, I was wrong. There was another way it could go, and that direction is straight and into another parking lot. When I arrived at the intersection, wouldn't you know it, it's the car from before, and it's parked, still cranked with its lights on facing the intersection. I'm sweating bullets and looking back over to where I planned on sleeping, hoping that I'm driving fast enough to lose this creep. My spot for the night was going to be a 24-hour gym. Lots of street lights and people walking across the lot at all hours of the night. It seemed like the perfect place to sleep. Since the previous night, I almost had a break-in while parked in a dark, empty area. I parked and wait. I don't see anyone other than gym rats with duffels and water bottles in hand. I let my guard down and start getting ready for bed. Just as I'm reaching the front seat to grab my phone, I see this car, and finally, the driver of the car, a white male, peering into the windshield of my van. As he does see me, as my front window is the only window that isn't tinted. We lock eyes, and I freak out. He starts circling my van with his vehicle, so I pull out and find a parking spot right next to the front door of the gym, where he can't circle me anymore. Well, Bucko doesn't give up. He parks across from me, car still cranked, lights still on, facing me. I understand that I'm in danger and decide to call someone I know that lives in Charleston. Thankfully, they let me stay with them for the night. So once I got the okay to head over, I drove out of the parking lot and drove as fast as I could to my friend's house. It was 30 minutes away and I was driving so fast, I don't even know if or how long the guy was following me for. Needless to say, #van life is a lot more dangerous than Instagram van dwellers would have you think. I felt duped and eventually just got an apartment. I felt a lot safer, and even though I would still like to travel, I intend to stay at an RV park the next go around. As far as the stalker I encountered, how about we never meet again, shall we? This is 100% true. I'm 23 now, and this happened about 10 years ago, so I was probably 13 or 14. Anyway, I used to skateboard all the time with my friends Tim and Brandon. One day, we got done skating, and we decided to go to 7-Eleven to get some food/drinks before we went home. Remember, I was fairly young, so wasn't driving. We had skated to the 7-Eleven and were planning on skating/walking back home. We buy our drinks, we leave the store, and we walk to the parking lot and prepare to cross the highway. Take note, it's not a busy highway since it's a small town. While we waited for the traffic light to turn red so that we could cross, I looked behind me at the 7-Eleven gas pump and noticed a 40 to 50-year-old man pumping gas into his white truck. He stared at me, and before I knew it, he dropped the gas pump and jumped into his truck. He slammed on the gas and sped straight at my friends and I. He missed us, but he grazed my arm and knocked my skateboard out of my hand. My friend Brandon screamed, "What are you doing?" as the man peeled out and sped into the parking lot next to 7-Eleven. I swear to God, he drove through a ditch which was between the 7-Eleven parking lot and the parking lot he was in and tried to run us over again. This is where it got bad. The three of us started running at full speed across the highway and towards the local library, which is about 2 to 3 blocks from the 7-Eleven. When we were about half a block away, I looked back and saw the maniac speeding towards us, full of rage. Brandon and Tim ran up to the library doors, and I ran towards the woods. It was Sunday, so I knew the library was closed, and there was a trail in the woods which led to my backyard. Meanwhile, this maniac peeled into the parking lot and hopped out of his truck. I looked behind me before escaping into the woods, and I saw him either grab a shotgun or a crowbar. I was pretty far away at this point, and my vision wasn't that great, not to mention I was freaking out. I ran all the way home, and when I got to my street, my neighbor, who was also Tim's dad, told me to get into his car because we had to go to the video store, which is where Tim's mum worked. When I got there, I found Tim and Brandon. They ran to the video store after realizing the library was closed, and 3 cops. A minute later, my mum came in, crying her eyes out, because Brandon and Tim told her they didn't know if I lived or not. Everyone had thought that I was captured. Tim told me that he saw the guy running after me into the woods, which is scary, because I thought the maniac was chasing them, not me. He was never caught, and I spent the next 5 years worrying about every white truck I saw. My town is small, but it's not empty. There were plenty of people around while this was going on. I felt so helpless running for my life, while there were at least 100 people around not doing anything about it. Also, to be clear, we didn't provoke this man at all. He tried to hit us for no reason, and that's creepy. Brandon called him a dick, but that was after he tried to run us over. We were good kids trying to walk home, and we almost got died/seriously hurt because of it. When I was a kid, I slept on the top bunk. My twin brother slept on the bottom bunk, and my oldest brother slept on a trundle bed pull-out just in front of the bunk bed. One night, I woke up and couldn't move. I was lying on my back, and all I could do was move my eyes. I was terrified, but I couldn't scream. From the corner of my eye, I looked out through the open door into the dark night, to where my father slept down the hall. I hoped I could see him, or tell him somehow, but all I could see was blackness and shadows, and then the shadows were walking. The black of dark took the form of a man, 6 foot tall, as featureless as any shadow on a sunny day. It was pure black, dark, abysmal. The shadows were walking into the room, and I could not scream. I watched him as he stepped from the floor onto my oldest brother, asleep on the trundle bed, but he didn't even wake nor move. The shadows had no weight and made no sound. I watched him grab the bar of the top bunk for leverage and step onto my twin brother's bed. He didn't wake up either, and I was now at eye level with the shadows walking. Gracefully and silently, he pulled himself to the top bunk, where he straddled his legs on either side of my mortified, stiff body. He sat there for a moment, as though staring at me. Then he placed his hands on my chest and pushed down hard and violently, angrily even, against my ribs. Just one horrible, aggravated force all at once. I blacked out from the pain and woke up the next morning still very much in pain all over my chest, but there were no bruises. I didn't tell anyone. I knew they wouldn't believe me. I don't believe me. My lungs strained to breathe that week, and it eventually went away, and the shadows have stayed in the corners. I'm a rational, logical man. I dismiss ghost stories out of hand and chalk them up to superstition or hallucinations brought on by sleep paralysis. But what I felt and saw that night, I can never forget what it was to see the shadows walking. If you're from England, more notably around London, you may have heard of the Croydon cat killer. This asshole lures cats towards him, and then he brutally kills them. They even remove the microchips and place the body near the family home, so that the shock level is higher. I don't live in Croydon. I live in an area in the southeast of London, and I have 2 cats. A couple of days ago, a road away from mine, someone stumbled on the remains of a black cat missing its head in a skip. Some people believed it to be foxes, even though I don't. I don't know many foxes who carry knives around with them and are able to cut clean lines. The police are even pushing this off in Croydon as foxes. The cat was taken to our local vet, and the vet there determined it was done by a person and not another animal. Then the police finally took notice down here. Only, I always call my cats from the back garden when it's dinner time, as my house backs onto a different but very close alleyway. And tonight when I shouted for my oldest cat, Alfie, I heard a few seconds later, Alfie, from the alleyway. My cats are both with me currently, and they aren't leaving anytime soon. To the sicko, who wasn't shown enough love as a child by mummy or daddy, know that if I ever catch you, I will skin you and hang you from a tree. with your minuscule little member hanging out of your mouth. I promise. And just to let everybody know, Snarl have investigated and are continuing to investigate this, and have also confirmed that this was done by a person and no fox. I really hope that he gets caught soon enough. Creeps like this shouldn't be allowed to walk the streets. Just about an hour ago, I was biking with a friend north on Congress Avenue towards downtown Austin, Texas. We were both about to start our shift for a food delivery app. We were engaged in a lively discussion as we approached the four-way intersection of Riverside and Congress, generally a dangerous place for cyclists. I was telling my friend about how I get stressed and feel bad about a lot of meaningless things while we waited for the red light to change. We were side by side in the bike lane, with not too much space between us. Suddenly, a third cyclist rode up and squeezed between us, very close, intimate even, a bit too much for a stranger. He was tall and pale with dark brown hair. He had on a beanie and a Coke bottle, glasses and a flannel, jeans and black Converse. His bike was old-fashioned, with wide silver handlebars, and he could have walked out of a 60s-era movie about reefer's madness, or just be your everyday hipster with no respect for personal space. He says, as if he's been in our conversation the whole time, "Don't worry, don't stress, try to be kind to everyone." His face was serene, and had blue eyes staring into the distance over the bridge towards the Capitol. Just then, the lights turned green. I looked at the third cyclist, but he didn't budge, so I took off. I'd only gone a few feet when I instinctively looked to my left, and behind me, I only see my friend Ryan. The third cyclist had completely vanished. As we crossed the intersection, Ryan said, "Was that your friend? Where did he go?" Looking behind us, we could see far into every direction, but he was gone. Dude, I've never seen him before. We were both dumbfounded. "That was a freaking ghost cyclist," said Ryan. "I'm not exactly sure what happened. All that I know is that we were talking for mere seconds, and then we realized he was gone. It was such a random and mystifying experience, in a place where I'm sure countless cyclists have died over the years. I'm thankful my friend was there as a witness though, as I feel like we've bonded over this experience, and going forward, I will surely follow the ghost cyclist's advice." This all started on an online game called League of Legends. Back in the time I used to play alone, so it was rare to see someone talking my native tongue, which was surprising when I saw two players in the in-game chat speaking back and forth in the language, and I got excited and replied as well. That's when I met this guy. We added each other on social media and quickly became friends. We also realized we lived on the same place but different islands. On a few days of getting to know him, I noticed that he was a guy who suffered from depression. So as a friend I tried to help him overcome it, but that just made him fall in love with me. Back at the time, I was 18 and he was 2 years older than me, and he decided to move to my island to continue his studies here. I honestly got so happy to meet him in person, and a few months after he moved here, and after some dates, we began a relationship. That was a big mistake. He was very jealous and wouldn't let me be with my friends or even my family. Sometimes my parents would pick him up and bring him to my house so he wouldn't be alone, and he refused to talk to them because he was mad that I was giving them too much attention. things started to escalate when he called me at night screaming on my phone, saying he was going to commit suicide if I didn't give him all of my attention or sleep with him. So I started experiencing anxiety every night, with fear of his calls, and never had the opportunity to end our relationship because I didn't want to be the cause of his suicide. One day I stayed home, afraid again of all of the abuse that I was suffering from his hand. It was on that day he sent me a Facebook picture of his shirt full of blood, and I almost dropped my phone. I spammed him with messages and missed calls trying to see if he was okay. I almost called an ambulance, afraid he was hurt or worse. And hours later he replied, saying nothing was going on, and that he got hurt during dinner and couldn't reply sooner. I got angry, demanding to know how he got the injury. He refused to tell me if I didn't call him first, so I did. And what he told me still gives me shivers. He told me that the bloody pictures weren't from an accident. He had purposefully cut himself so that he could get pleasure with my panic and attention towards him. When I heard this, I switched off my phone, got a panic attack, and my parents rushed to my bedroom, and I told them what was going on. Before we all blocked him on social media, I told him to never contact me again and that our relationship was over. The next day, I received several phone calls and threats from his mother and family, and I decided to wake up earlier the day after to go to school since he knew my schedules. On the way there, I called a friend to let her know what happened and to give me company until I went to class. We were talking in the school cafeteria, full of people. When class started, most of the students were making their way there. That's when my friend, with silent wide eyes, looked at me. I looked back and jumped. It was my ex. He had the most dead eyes I'd ever seen in my life. When I saw that he had something in his pockets, I bolted. I'd never run so fast in my life. I quickly got up and looked at the bathroom stall. When the maintenance lady saw me running, she came after me and asked me what was going on. I told her there was a man in school that wasn't a student and that he was after me and could be armed. She quickly got me locked up in a classroom and called the police. They came but never found him, and they took me to the station to write a report. This was a year ago, and they never found him. I guess he went back to his other island when he saw trouble coming, and I hope we never meet again. This happened almost 2 years ago. It was summertime, and I was about to turn 21. Even after the fact, I still looked as though I was underage. For reference, I'm a female, fairly short and baby-faced. This particular summer I worked at a truck stop combined with 2 fast food chains. I worked in one of the fast food areas. Something else to mention is that this truck stop was located right next to a very busy highway. This meant that we received an abundance of customers on a daily basis. Our fast food chain was employed only by women, particularly high school students, as the area did not have many places to find work. Once I began working there, I immediately began to notice that one man stood out every time he came into our workplace. This man was in his 40s with black hair, thin stick, dressed in all black and wearing a fedora. No matter what, he always wore the fedora. As someone who had just started working there, I really made it a point to focus on making connections with the customers, like making eye contact, introducing myself and smiling a lot. Basically, just trying to be the best employee that I could be. The first time this man came in, he was straight-faced and did not speak much. I took his order, and when he left, my co-workers began to talk about how he was a weird guy. Fedora Man would come into our workplace every single day and comment on my very underage co-workers' appearance, even go as far as to ask them for their phone numbers. My co-workers have told him many times that they are not interested, underage and the like, but this did nothing to deter him. I was immediately concerned, but tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. My second encounter with Fedora Man was vastly different. This time Fedora Man seemed eager to see me. I recall so vividly how he watched me serve every single customer in line. Each time he got closer to ordering, his smile would grow wider and wider. Once it was his turn, the first thing that came out of his mouth was, "You're a lot nicer than all the girls here." Not once did that creepy smile leave his face. I don't think I even saw him blink. I thanked him and continued with his order. Fedora Man thanked me and off he went. After about an hour or so of serving customers, I was asked by the manager to step into his office. Once inside, my manager gave me a heads up that Fedora Man called our gas station to personally let her know that I was a great addition to the team. Fedora Man also asked for my number. My manager hoped that by telling him that I was underage, even though I wasn't, and this didn't stop him from hitting on my other underage co-workers, that this would deter him from trying to get my number. His exact words per my manager were, "I don't mind a little jailbait." My manager let Fedora Man know that this was incredibly inappropriate, and Fedora Man laughed and then hung up the phone. As he had tried asking for multiple girls their numbers, she decided to finally do something about it and notified our male supervisor. The next day, the Fedora Man was approached by our supervisor as he walked into the store. They talked for a few moments before he stomped out, and he did not look happy. Later on, my manager would tell us that our supervisor did not ban Fedora Man from the store, but rather let him know that he was making us uncomfortable. This did not deter Fedora Man, as he returned the next day and specifically asked for me. I was nervous, but still served him, as it was my job. This time, Fedora Man asked for my number in person. If I wasn't working, I would have said, "Hell to the no," but as I was on the clock, I politely declined. Fedora Man continued to smile, showing all of his teeth. He continued to return every single day, and specifically asked for me. After a few days of this going on, I finally broke down and asked to work in the back of the store every time he came in, so that I could avoid seeing him. Fedora Man made me incredibly uncomfortable, and I wanted to avoid seeing him as much as possible. The last time I ever saw him was a week or two right before summer's end. After weeks of trying to desperately avoid him, things finally came to a boil. On this day, I worked the early shift, and therefore began doing the usual stuff. Turning on machines, prepping items, and my manager was the only one there with me. She'd stepped out for a little cigarette break. Usually, we do not get customers in that early. My guard was down since I was in the back of the store where no customers were allowed, and I had some music playing. I was singing along to the music and prepping for the day when I saw a black mass dart in front of me. I turned off my music and asked if someone was there. No answer. As I was already jittery from Fedora Man, I simply told myself that I was overreacting and turned my music back on once more. After a few moments, I felt someone behind me. I turned, and who do you think it was? Fedora Man. I let out a yelp in surprise, which only made him laugh heartily. He stated that he was hungry and wanted some food. I immediately began to scold him and reminded him this was an area for workers only. At this point, my manager returns from her cigarette break and sees that he's in the back of the store. She shouts at him to leave and states, "She doesn't even like you," in the biggest voice that she could muster. Fedora Man smiled his toothy smile and simply walked to the front of the store. I refused to serve him and let my manager know that he needs to be banned. I wish I could say this story had a happy ending, but it doesn't. I ended up leaving that job a week later and haven't got back since. I occasionally talk to my old co-workers, and they've let me know that Fedora Man still comes in every day, hitting on the underage girls there and asking when I will be coming back to work. I was 9 years old, and we were all packed into my mother's car on a trip to visit family for the Thanksgiving holidays. Our trip took us through Tuckersville, Arkansas, and it just happened that we needed to make a pit stop for gas at the T-Rex there. I don't know if it's still there. The last time I was by that way was 2012. My mother, sister and I got out of the car and made our way inside to use the restroom. There was a man in a beige coat and matching cowboy hat crossing the pavement nearly even with us, though none of us saw him get out of his car or anything. He made the building before us and ended up standing beside the door, faced as if he was staring at the ice coolers along the side of the building. My mother urged us both to pass him and into the well-lit building. My mum must have had a gut reaction, because when we were all done with what we needed to do, she held us back by the shoulder and told us to wait for our stepfather. As we wandered the store, wasting time for my stepdad to finish pumping gas, the man remained where he had been when we had come in. I kept glancing at him, feeling more and more creeped out. It took quite a while for my stepdad to come in after us. I guess he hadn't needed to use the restroom and assumed we'd come out to meet him. And that whole time, the cowboy man stood by the door motionless. Finally, my stepfather came through the door, huffing in frustration because it was late at night and he was ready to get back on the road. When he asked my mum what took us so long, she answered that she was waiting for the man to leave. My stepdad raised an eyebrow. What man? In his frustration, he apparently hadn't noticed the man in the cowboy hat. That one, my mother said, suddenly very pale. She was pointing out the window, where we all saw that the man had turned to face into the store. He was grinning at us. I'm sure it was the shadow from his hat, but his eyes were just pools of darkness, and my 9-year-old brain registered this as having no eyes at all. We wound up waiting in that store for a solid 20 minutes, that man standing there grinning at us the whole time. It seemed like no one else had noticed him. The employees paid him no mind. Finally, when my mother and stepfather were discussing making a break for it, a middle-aged woman walked through the door. She made a purchase quickly and left. As the door closed behind her, the cowboy hat man very slowly turned away from us as he moved to follow her. We didn't stick around to see what happened. As soon as the door cleared, my parents hustled out of the building and into the car. My stepfather burnt rubber pulling out of the parking lot. We've shared this story many times trying to see if our memories match up. I know I've wondered if it was a hallucination, but there's no way that 4 people could hallucinate the exact same thing. When I was 13, I started modeling. I did fairly well, but I honestly hated the business. They were really strict about my weight. I couldn't get over 100 pounds in weight, or I'd lose my contracts. I couldn't dye my hair or have any piercings without permission, and they would often check to make sure I hadn't gone against their wishes. Fast forward 2 years of me being 15. One day I got an email from a fitness photographer. This wasn't uncommon for me to get random emails, because my agency would give my email out once they booked me on something. This was also about 12 years ago, and back then I naively didn't worry too much about anything. You know the common teenage mentality of, nothing's ever going to happen to me. In the email, the photographer told me he'd like to do a shoot, and the compensation he promised me. I would have made more money than I have out of any other shoot. So obviously being money driven, I emailed him back and told him yes, I'd be interested. And he shoots me an email back after saying that he needed some sample photos of my calves, my feet, my backside and my breasts to make sure I had the physique he wanted. I was a little cautious, but I thought, he's offering a lot of money. I should probably do what he's asking or he's going to find someone else. And that's exactly what he wanted. He wanted me to feel the pressure to send him the pictures, and I did feel the pressure. Of course, I had it in the back of my mind that I shouldn't do it, but the money sounded so good. I sent the pictures clothed, and he said he couldn't tell my proper sizing, and I needed to send him nude photos. I declined this and told him I would be willing to set up a meeting and his assistant can take measurements, but I would not send nude photos over the internet. He set up a meeting but cancelled last minute, and a few weeks later, he was on the news. He got busted for indecent images of children, and shocker, he wasn't a fitness photographer. Who knows what could have happened to me had I actually gone to meet him. I never found out how he got my email. My agency said they never spoke with him. So creepy man, I'm glad you cancelled our meeting. I'm glad I never got to meet you face to face, and never intend to. My brother and I were driving through Montana in the middle of the night, and got held up near Bozeman because a semi had taken out a passenger van with 6 or 7 people in it. We only have that estimation because we both sat mute while we watched parts being taken out of the van. It just so happened the accident was seconds old when we got there. A truck driving the opposite direction flashed us with alarming "slow down now" frequency, and we did. The driver of the semi was physically fine, but the cops interviewing him parked on the shoulder next to us, and we could hear him as he wailed and sobbed and apologized. We were watching the EMT crew pull a head attached to a neck and part of an arm, while the driver started begging the cops for forgiveness. We sat there for 5 hours. The cops explained to us, being close up and getting out to smoke a while afterwards, that it was in no way the semi-driver's fault. It's on my top 5 things I would like to unremember. Arms and legs all over the place.